Dorothy Hale slammed the ledger down on the kitchen work table so hard that the salt cellar jumped and clattered to the floor, and she didn't bother looking at it. "You fed that drifter," she said. Not a question. Her voice was flat and cold the way a knife blade is flat and cold before it cuts. "You went into my stores, took my flour, my salt pork, my coffee, and you fed a man who hadn't earned 1 cent at this ranch." Mabel Whitlock stood with her hands still dusted white, a mixing bowl balanced against her hip. She was 33 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that had learned patience the hard way. She didn't flinch. "He was hungry," Mabel said. "Everyone on the frontier is hungry." Dorothy stepped around the table until she was close enough that Mabel could smell the lavender water she wore. "That is not your concern. Your concern is this kitchen. My kitchen." She turned then and faced the 3 ranch hands who had drifted to the doorway, drawn by the sound of the ledger hitting wood. "You want to see what happens when a cook decides the rules don't apply to her?" Nobody answered. One of the younger hands looked at his boots. Dorothy smiled. "Take her to the bunkhouse kitchen." If you've ever been punished for the one decent thing you did all day, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel right now and follow Mabel's story all the way to the end, because what happens in the next 2 months is something nobody at Red Cedar Ranch saw coming. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your city or country below so we can see how far this story has traveled, and let's begin. The bunkhouse kitchen sat at the far edge of the Red Cedar property, behind a stand of cottonwoods that had grown tall enough to block the afternoon light. Nobody had cooked in it regularly for 6 or 7 years. Not since old Pete Garver had keeled over mid-stir into a pot of beans, and the boys who found him decided the whole building had gone sour after that. The door hung crooked on its leather hinges. The iron stove inside had a crack along the firebox that somebody had filled with clay that had since crumbled out again. The chimney pipe was so clogged with old bird nests and grease that lighting a fire would fill the room with smoke before it pulled the first draft. 3 of the 4 windows were covered with oilcloth nailed directly to the frame because the glass had been broken out and nobody had bothered ordering replacements. It was not a kitchen. It was a place someone had once used as a kitchen, the way a man sometimes uses a ditch for shelter in a rainstorm. Not because it's good, but because it's what's there. 2 of the Cowboys, Ed Pruitt and a young Texas boy everyone called Skeeter, hauled Mabel's wooden supply crate out from the main kitchen, while Dorothy Hale stood in the yard watching with her arms folded. They didn't say anything while they worked. Ed was careful with the crate. He set it on the bunkhouse step gently, which struck Mabel as an odd kindness from a man who hadn't said 10 words to her in the 3 months she'd been at the ranch. "You'll take your meals from here starting tomorrow morning," Dorothy told her. "The hands eat at 6. You'll have biscuits, coffee, and whatever you can put together from what's in that crate." Mabel looked at the crate. She looked at the building. She looked at Dorothy Hale's face, which had gone smooth and satisfied the way faces do when they believe they've settled something. "Yes, ma'am," Mabel said. Dorothy turned and walked back to the main house. Her heels made sharp sounds on the dry ground. Ed Pruitt waited until she was through the door before he turned to Mabel with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between guilty and impressed. "You don't have to stay," he said. "Lots of cooks just leave when she does this." "Does she do this often?" Ed scratched the back of his neck. "3rd time this year." Mabel picked up her crate and carried it inside. The smell was the first thing. Old grease and char and something underneath both of those that she couldn't name right away and then recognized as mouse. Not one mouse. A community. The floor was dirt-packed so hard it had gone almost to concrete, but there were loose spots near the stove where something had been digging. Tin plates were stacked on a shelf, filmed with a gray coating that wasn't dust exactly, more like the residue of years of smoke settling and settling and settling. The work table was solid at least, thick pine, probably older than anything else on the property. But the surface had been carved up by men idling with pocket knives, leaving a geography of shallow trenches that would collect whatever she didn't manage to wipe out of them. She set the crate down on the table. She stood still for a moment and looked at everything. A different woman might have sat down and let the feeling have her for a while. The feeling was there. She could identify it exactly, a hot pressure behind her sternum that wanted to become something louder. 2 years since her husband Thomas had died of the fever outside of Abilene, alone in a boarding house room while she sat in the hall because the landlady wouldn't let her in during the contagion. 14 months of cooking at 2 other ranches before Red Cedar, both of which had let her go when the owners decided they could get a younger woman for cheaper. 3 months here doing work that was solid and honest and good, producing meals that the hands ate without complaint and often with something approaching gratitude. And now this cracked stove, this collapsing chimney, these mice living royally in the walls. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and then she went looking for a broom. There wasn't one. There was the stick that had once been a broom handle, and a few straw wisps attached to it that were more suggestion than instrument. She used it anyway. She started in the far corner and worked toward the door, and the dust and mouse droppings and old straw moved reluctantly in front of her. It took her 4 passes to get the floor to a state she could call improvement, and by then the light outside had shifted toward late afternoon orange and her arms were aching. Skeeter appeared in the doorway. He was 19 or maybe 20, with a chin that hadn't fully committed to growing a beard yet. He was carrying a bucket. "Water," he said, holding it up as evidence. "Thank you, Skeeter." He set the bucket inside the door and then stood there, looking around at what she'd done so far, which was not much but was visible. "Miss Mabel," he started. She does this to people she's scared of." Mabel wrung out a rag and started on the work table. "I'm just a cook." "Yes, ma'am." He shifted his weight. "That's sort of the point, I think." He left before she could answer that, which was probably just as well because she wasn't sure what she would have said. She worked until it was too dark to see, and then lit the single candle she found in the supply crate. Her own candle, packed in her own things, because she had learned by now to carry a candle, and worked a little longer. She cleared the stovepipe as far up as she could reach with a length of wire she found hanging on a nail outside. She scraped the firebox clean of its old ash and the crumbled clay and packed the crack herself, using dirt from outside the door, mixed thick with water from Skeeter's bucket until it was the consistency of good plaster. It wouldn't last forever, but it would last long enough to be useful. She did not sleep well. The cot in the corner of the bunkhouse kitchen had a tick mattress that had gone flat and smelled of age, and the mice were active until well past midnight, and she woke twice to sounds that turned out to be wind against the oilcloth windows. But she woke at 4:30 as she always did, before the sky was anything but black, and she started the fire. The chimney didn't pull cleanly. Smoke backed into the room before catching the draft, and when it did catch it wheezed and shuddered, and she had the door and both working windows open while she coaxed the stove up to heat. Her eyes watered. She stood back from it and turned her face toward the window and breathed clean air and then went back in and adjusted the damper and tried again. By 5 o'clock, the stove was running. She had salt pork, flour, a small amount of baking powder, dried beans that would need all day to cook properly, a half wheel of hard cheese, 3 onions, and coffee. That was what the crate contained. It was not a generous inventory, but it was not nothing. She made biscuits the way her mother had taught her, by feel rather than measurement, cutting the salt pork fat and cold and working it until the flour was barely combined, just ragged enough to be uncertain, which is the exact texture that produces lightness. She put the first pan in at 5:30. The Cowboys came at 6, 13 of them from the bunkhouse proper, still pulling on their jackets and moving slowly the way men do before coffee has done its work. They came through the door and stopped, because the smell hit them. Fresh biscuits and hot coffee and the faint edge of salt pork crisped in the pan. And they had been expecting something considerably worse. "Huh," said one of them. A man named Clarence, older, with a gray mustache he kept very neat for a working cowboy. He looked around the room, which was still not clean by any generous definition, but was different from what they'd expected. He looked at Mabel, who was standing at the stove with a towel over one shoulder and a pan in her hands. "You actually got that stove running." "Coffee's on the table," she said. "Biscuits in about 2 minutes. I've got beans soaking. They won't be ready until supper." "You got beans soaking already?" "Started them last night." Clarence looked at the man next to him, whose name was Webb, and Webb looked back at him with an expression that communicated something without using words. They sat down. Nobody complained about the food. 14-year-old Skeeter, who had shown up with the others and was clearly expecting disaster, ate 3 biscuits and then looked at his hands as if he wasn't sure what had just happened. A cowboy named Dutch, who was the bunkhouse foreman and had a reputation for being hard to please, asked twice for more coffee without saying anything else, which Mabel understood was the equivalent of a formal compliment. It was not a triumph. It was breakfast. But it was breakfast that worked, made in a room that shouldn't have been able to produce it, and every man who ate it knew that. Dorothy Hale appeared in the doorway at 6:30. She stood there, looking at the men eating, and then looked at Mabel, and her expression shifted, just slightly, just for a moment, before it settled back into its usual composed authority. "You managed," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Dorothy's eyes moved around the room again. The clean table, the swept floor, the stove burning steadily, The men who were, against all reasonable expectation, sitting and eating rather than complaining. "Don't let it go to your head," she said, and left. Dutch watched her go. When the sound of her footsteps faded, he said, without looking up from his coffee, "She hates losing." "She didn't lose anything," Mabel said, refilling his cup. "She gave me a kitchen." Dutch looked up at that. A slow, reluctant smile worked its way across his face. He had a gap between his front teeth that he usually kept hidden. "Yeah," he said. "I guess she did." The second day was harder because the novelty of survival had passed and what remained was the reality of doing it again with the same inadequate materials. Mabel walked the supply inventory carefully in the morning, parceling out what she had against what the week would require, and the numbers didn't add up the way she needed them to. She needed lard, or at least more fat. She needed salt. She needed dried fruit or something sweet, or the men would begin losing the thread of goodwill that she'd established with the biscuits, because goodwill built on biscuits alone is a thin and temporary thing. She went to find Dutch. He was in the corral doing something complicated with a bit of harness equipment, and he looked up when she approached without any evident surprise, as if he'd been half expecting her to appear. "I need to talk to someone about the supply situation," she said. "That'd be Dorothy." "I know it would be Dorothy. I'm asking you first." Dutch set down the harness. He studied her face for a moment. "What do you need?" she told him. He listened without interrupting, which was not something she had expected from him, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment with one hand on the top rail of the fence. "I can't go against Dorothy on supplies," he said. "She keeps the books." "I know." "But the boys who go into town on Saturday for the mail run sometimes pick up extra goods if somebody gives them a list and the money for it." "I don't have money. Some of the boys might contribute." She looked at him steadily. "Why would they do that?" Dutch shrugged, but it wasn't a casual shrug. It was the shrug of a man who has thought something through and doesn't want to appear to have thought it through. "Because the biscuits were good," he said, "and because they've been eating Dorothy's cook's food for 8 months and your worst day is better than her best one. And because," he paused, "because some of us remember what it's like when somebody treats you like you matter, and it's worth a few cents to keep that going." Mabel stood there for a moment in the morning light with the smell of the corral around her and the sound of the ranch's daily business going on in all directions, and something in her chest that had been held tight for a very long time loosened by exactly 1 degree. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Dutch said, picking the harness back up. "Thank me if Dorothy doesn't find out and fire both of us." He was not joking. Dorothy Hale ran Red Cedar Ranch with a precision and a watchfulness that had eliminated most of the carelessness that ranches tend to accumulate over time, and part of that watchfulness extended to who was talking to whom and about what. Mabel understood this without anyone having to tell her explicitly. You learn to read a place quickly when your survival depends on the reading. By the end of the first week, the bunkhouse kitchen had become something that resisted the name the ranch owner Harold Hale had given it when he'd assigned it to Mabel, which was the punishment kitchen. Harold was a man in his late 50s who had built Red Cedar from one section of grassland into a working ranch of substantial acreage, but he had done this by being good with cattle and land deals and largely terrible at managing the people around him. He had delegated that entirely to Dorothy, who was his wife, and who had a talent for authority that Harold lacked. This arrangement had worked well for the cattle operation and less well for the humans involved in it. Harold appeared at the bunkhouse kitchen on a Thursday morning, walking through the door during the breakfast rush with the slightly guilty expression of a man entering a place he knows he probably shouldn't have let deteriorate in the first place. He looked at the stove, the clean surfaces, the men sitting quietly with their food. He looked at Mabel. "Dorothy tells me you've made yourself at home," he said. "Just doing the job, Mr. Hale." He picked up a biscuit from the basket on the table without asking, which Mabel noted but didn't comment on. He ate half of it standing there. His expression changed. "What kind of flour are you using?" "Same as what's in the crate your wife gave me." "Can't be." "It is. The method matters more than the ingredients, usually." Harold finished the biscuit. He looked around the room again with eyes that were doing arithmetic. Not about the food, but about something else. What exactly, she couldn't be sure. "How long before Dorothy gives you more supplies?" he asked. "I don't know that she will." "You need more." "Yes." He stood there for another moment, then he said, "I'll have a word," and left. 3 days later, a supply order arrived that was more generous than anything the main kitchen had received in weeks. Dorothy said nothing about it. Mabel said nothing about it. The understanding between them shifted in a way that neither acknowledged out loud. The 4th week was when the first outside cowboys began arriving. A cattle drive out of Texas had been pushing north for 6 weeks, and the lead drover, a sun-dried man named Carson who ran a crew of 11, had come ahead of the herd to scout water sources and had ended up at Red Cedar's fence line, asking if there was a place to fill canteens and rest for an hour. Ed Pruitt pointed him toward the bunkhouse kitchen, partly out of genuine hospitality and partly, Mabel suspected later, because Ed wanted to see what would happen. Carson came through the door the way men do when they've been outside too long, cautious, slightly disoriented by anything with walls and a roof. He smelled the coffee and visibly relaxed. He sat down at the table without being invited and said, "Ma'am, I am not too proud to tell you I have not been inside a building in 23 days. Mabel put a cup in front of him. "Eat first, talk later." He ate. He ate with the specific quality of attention that men who have been eating trail food give to real cooking. Not with enthusiasm exactly, but with a kind of serious gratitude, the way you are grateful for something that you had forgotten was possible. When he finished, he sat back and looked at his hands. "What do I owe you?" he said. "Nothing. You're a guest." Carson looked up. "Nobody gives away food on the frontier." "I'm not giving it away. You'll remember this place when you're back this way. You'll tell other drovers. That's worth more than cash." He studied her face for a moment, this big, plain-faced woman with flour on her apron and eyes that had seen a fair amount of hard weather. "You're running a business," he said. "I'm running a kitchen," she said. "They're not always different things." He told 2 other trail bosses about her before the month was out. They each told 2 more. The main ranch hands from the Red Cedar property had, by this point, established something like a standing army of protection around the bunkhouse kitchen that nobody had formally organized and nobody talked about directly. When a pair of drovers came through in the 5th week who were louder than necessary and made a comment about Mabel's size that was intended to be overheard, Dutch was on his feet before the second word was out. He didn't raise his voice. He stood up from the bench and set his cup down and said very quietly, something that caused both men to change the subject immediately and eat their food in silence. Mabel didn't ask him what he'd said. She refilled their cups as if nothing had happened. Later, cleaning up, she stood at the work table and let herself feel it. Not the insult, which she'd heard in various versions for most of her adult life, but the other thing. The fact that someone had stood up. She did not cry. She had made a personal policy against crying in the kitchen, on the grounds that kitchens required clear eyes and she couldn't afford to be blind in her own workspace. But she stood there for a long moment with her hands flat on the old pine table and breathed. She had carried Thomas's death in the center of herself the way you carry an injury that hasn't healed clean. Always aware of it, adjusting around it, careful not to put full weight on it. Before he died, they had traveled together through 4 territories, and she had cooked in every configuration imaginable. Over open fires, in cramped boarding house kitchens, in the back of a wagon with a camp stove that vented into her face. He had eaten everything she made with total and uncritical appreciation, not because he lacked taste, but because he understood what cooking cost and he honored the cost. Nobody had honored the cost since, until Dutch stood up from a bench without being asked. Small things. She had learned to notice them because large things happened less often. By the end of the 6th week, the bunkhouse kitchen had a reputation that reached further than Red Cedar's fence lines. Cowboys on the trail talked the way people who spend long days outdoors and long nights awake always talk, steadily, to pass the time, and about food more than anything else, because food is the most immediate measurement of whether the day has been decent or brutal. Word about Mabel's kitchen traveled the same trails the cattle did, moving north and east with every outfit that had stopped at Red Cedar. Dorothy Hale was not unaware of this. She had a system of information. Mostly the cook at the main house, a tight-lipped woman named Rosa who had survived Dorothy's management for 4 years by being entirely reliable and entirely invisible. And through this system, Dorothy kept herself informed about most things that happened on the property. She appeared one evening when the dinner rush had cleared and the kitchen was empty except for Mabel doing her end-of-day cleaning. She stood in the doorway the way she always did, using the door frame the way some people use a podium, and she looked at the room for a long moment. "People are talking about you," Dorothy said. "People talk about everything," Mabel said, not stopping her work. "Trail bosses." Dorothy moved into the room properly, which she rarely did. She stood at the table and put one finger on its surface and looked at the contact point. Clean. "By name. They're asking for you specifically." Mabel wrung out her rag and moved to the next section of table. "Is that a problem? It reflects on the ranch." "In a good way, I'd think." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Her jaw moved slightly, which Mabel had learned to read as the sign of an internal struggle between what she wanted to say and what she thought it was strategic to say. "I underestimated you," Dorothy said finally. The words came out like something she'd been storing under pressure. Not an apology exactly, more like a release of something she'd had to hold for a long time. Mabel straightened up. She looked at Dorothy Hale directly for the first time since the day of the ledger. "You wanted me to leave," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement. Dorothy's chin came up. "Yes." "Why?" The chin stayed up. Her hands were very still. "Because you walked in here and the men liked you inside of a week, and I have been on this ranch for 11 years, and they respect me and they follow my orders, and they have never once—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "You make it look easy." Mabel thought about what to say and then decided to say the truth because she was tired and the day had been long and she didn't have the energy for strategy. "It's not easy," she said. "I've been getting the same comments you heard those drovers make since I was 16 years old. There isn't a week I don't hear them. The difference is I stopped waiting for people to think I was worth something and started acting like I already knew I was." She picked up her rag again. "That's not easy. That's just what you do when there's no other option." Dorothy stood there for what felt like a long time. Her face had an expression Mabel had not seen on it before. Not softened exactly, but opened. Like a door that had been warped shut in the summer heat and was finally giving way. She left without saying anything else. But the next morning, the supply crate that arrived at the bunkhouse kitchen contained, among other things, a new cast iron skillet, 2 pounds of dried apricots, a full sack of sugar, and a note in Dorothy's sharp handwriting that said only, "Wednesday delivery." Same as main kitchen. Mabel held the note for a moment. Then she put it in her apron pocket and started the fire. She had peach hand pies planned for Friday. The boys had been asking about something sweet for 2 weeks. She'd been waiting until she had the sugar. Now she had the sugar. She started the fire and got to work. The peach hand pies came out of the oven on a Friday afternoon, and by the time the supper bell rang, there wasn't a man on the property who hadn't already smelled them from 50 yards out. Skeeter arrived first, which was not surprising. He had developed a habit of appearing near the bunkhouse kitchen approximately 20 minutes before any meal with some excuse ready. A question about the water barrel, a loose board on the step that needed looking at, a message from Dutch that could probably have waited. This time he came through the door carrying a length of rope he'd been mending and stopped dead when he saw the pies cooling on the rack. "Those are for after supper," Mabel said, without turning around. "Yes, ma'am." He stood there anyway. "Skeeter." "I'm just standing here. You're standing here looking at the pies. A man can stand." She pointed at the door with her spoon. He went, but slowly, and she could hear him on the step outside shuffling his boots in a way that indicated he had not gone far. The men ate supper, salt pork and beans with the dried apricots she'd gotten from Dorothy's delivery cooked in with them, which gave the whole pot a depth it wouldn't have had otherwise, a slight sweetness against the salt that nobody could identify specifically, but everybody noticed. And then she brought the pies out and set them on the table still warm, and the room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something exceeds what was expected. Dutch ate his in 2 bites and then sat looking at the remaining half of it on his plate for a moment before eating that too. Clarence, who was not a demonstrative man, said, "Lord have mercy," and immediately looked like he regretted saying anything. Webb, who was from somewhere in Georgia originally and had a nostalgic relationship with fruit-based pastry, ate his pie with the careful, deliberate attention of a man trying to make something last. "My grandmother made something like this," he said to nobody in particular. "Not exactly like this, but close enough that it—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "It's good," he finished, which was not what he'd started to say, but it was what he was willing to say in a room full of working cowboys. Mabel heard the thing he hadn't said. She always heard those. The spaces in sentences where men swallowed the thing that was actually true, because the actually true thing was too personal for a communal table. She'd been hearing them her whole adult life. She started refilling coffee cups and didn't comment because that was the right thing to do with a man's private grief. You saw it, you acknowledged it silently, and you kept moving. The week after the pies was the week Carson came back. He arrived on a Tuesday with his full crew, 11 men, horses road-worn, the herd itself bedded a mile south at a creek crossing. And he came through the bunkhouse kitchen door the same way he had the first time, cautious and disoriented by walls, except this time he had 10 men filing in behind him and he was grinning. "Told you I'd be back," he said. "You did," Mabel said. She had already been adding water to the bean pot. She'd seen the dust of a significant outfit moving in from the South Road an hour earlier and had made the calculation without being entirely sure she was right about who it was. "How'd you know?" Carson asked, watching her work. "Didn't. But a good kitchen feeds whoever comes through the door. You learn to keep extra." She fed 11 trail hands and Carson himself, and the Red Cedar Cowboys ate alongside them without the territorial friction that sometimes developed when outside men came into a working ranch's space. This was partly Dutch's doing. He had a way of setting the tone in a room without appearing to set anything. And partly the kitchen itself, which had an equalizing effect that Mabel hadn't entirely planned. There was not enough room for posturing. You sat where there was space, and you ate what was in front of you, and the food was the same for everyone regardless of whose brand was on the cattle outside. Carson's crew were mostly young men, teenagers some of them, with the worn-out look of people who had been living at the edge of their physical capacity for weeks. 2 of them were clearly sick. Not dangerously, but trail sick, the kind of low-grade misery that comes from bad water and too much sun and not enough of anything that could be called rest. She made a separate pot of thin broth for those 2 and brought it to them without mentioning that it was different from what everyone else was getting, because there is a dignity in receiving care that doesn't draw attention to the need for it. One of the sick boys, he couldn't have been 17, looked up when she set the broth in front of him. "What's this for?" he said. Not ungrateful, just surprised. "You look like you could use something gentle," Mabel said. He stared at the broth. He stared at it for long enough that she understood he was working against something, and then he picked up the cup and drank it without saying anything else. His hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly. Carson watched this from across the table. When the meal was done and his men were moving out to the yard to ready the horses, he stayed behind. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and watched Mabel clear the table. "You know what the boys call you on the trail?" he said. "I don't. They call you the woman at Red Cedar. Just that. No name. Just, there's a woman at Red Cedar." He paused. "That's not nothing. In my experience, you earn a description like that, or you don't earn anything at all." Mabel stacked the tin plates. "How far north are you going?" "Abilene, Railhead, maybe 3 more weeks if the water holds. Tell whoever you meet that the kitchen's here." Carson smiled the way men smile when they realize they've been maneuvered by someone considerably more strategic than they appeared. "Already planned on it," he said. He was good to his word. The following 2 weeks brought a steady trickle of riders stopping at the Bunkhouse kitchen, some with outfits, some alone, some clearly running from something and not interested in explaining what. Mabel fed them all without questions. She had established a simple principle early. If you came through the door and you were hungry, you ate. What you'd done before you arrived and where you were going after were your own business. This produced some complications. A man came through on a Thursday in the 7th week who introduced himself as Harvey and who ate 2 full plates and 3 biscuits and drank 4 cups of coffee and then, when he stood to leave, said in a voice pitched for the room, "I've eaten in fancier places than this. Can't say the food's much to speak of." The table went still. There were 6 Red Cedar men eating and 4 riders from a passing outfit, and everyone in the room processed what had just been said and what it meant and what the appropriate response was. Mabel was at the stove. She did not turn around immediately. She finished what she was doing, which was lifting a skillet off the heat and set it on the rest, and then she turned around and looked at Harvey. He was a medium-sized man with a face that had the particular expression of someone who had decided to make himself feel large at someone else's expense and was waiting to see if it would work. "Thank you for eating with us," Mabel said. Her voice was entirely level. "Safe travels." Harvey blinked. He had clearly expected either defensiveness or apology and gotten neither, and the absence of those things left him without a next move. He stood there for one more moment, and then he went out the door. The room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then Skeeter said, very quietly, "What a horse's rear." Mabel pointed at him. "Language." "Yes, ma'am. Sorry." He picked up his biscuit. "Still, though." Dutch was watching the door Harvey had walked out of with an expression that suggested he was running several options in his mind and selecting the most restrained one. He settled on picking up his coffee cup, but his jaw was tight. "You didn't have to do that," he said to Mabel. "Do what?" "Be polite to him." "I was polite to him because I have a kitchen to run and a reputation that's worth more than whatever satisfaction I'd get from being otherwise." She went back to the stove. "He'll tell people about this place whether he means to flatter it or not. People here the food wasn't much, and they decide for themselves when they arrive. The food does its own arguing." Clarence made a sound that was approximately a laugh. Webb shook his head slowly. Dutch unclenched his jaw. "You think about this stuff. Dutch said. Not a question. I think about everything, Mabel said. That's how the kitchen stays open. What she didn't say, because it wasn't something she could say at a communal table without it sounding like complaint, was that she had not slept a full night since the first week. The mice situation had improved, but not resolved. There were still 2 or 3 operating somewhere in the wall behind the stove, and she heard them at night and lay there calculating what she could do about them with the limited resources she had. The cot had not gotten more comfortable. The chimney still required careful management in the morning, or it would back smoke into the room, and she had developed a cough that came and went depending on how the wind was sitting. Her lower back had begun protesting the hours she spent standing on the hard-packed dirt floor, and she had taken to wearing an extra folded cloth inside her boot on the left side where the arch had been complaining since February. None of this showed in the food. That was the thing that nobody saw. The invisible labor of keeping the invisible problems from becoming visible ones. She managed it the same way she managed everything, which was methodically and without fanfare, and sometimes in the middle of the night when there was nothing else to do. The supply situation continued to improve in small increments. Dorothy's Wednesday deliveries had expanded to include things Mabel hadn't asked for. A tin of molasses, a wheel of better cheese than the hard yellow block she'd been working through, once a small quantity of vanilla extract that cost more than it should have, and that Mabel used sparingly and with great deliberation. She suspected Harold's hand in some of these additions. She suspected that Dorothy suspected she suspected this, and that they had both decided not to discuss it. The relationship between Mabel and Dorothy had settled into something that had no clean name. Not friendship, not the original hostility either. Something careful and watchful and occasionally, unexpectedly, almost warm. Dorothy had begun stopping by the kitchen more regularly, not always at mealtimes, sometimes in the middle of the afternoon when the ranch was quiet. She would stand in the doorway and make some comment about the supply order or the schedule, and Mabel would answer, and occasionally the conversation would drift slightly sideways from the stated purpose into something more personal before both of them noticed and redirected. One afternoon, Dorothy came in during the quiet hour and sat down at the table. Actually sat, which she rarely did in the bunkhouse kitchen, and said without preamble, "How do you make the biscuits?" Mabel looked at her. "You want to know how to make biscuits?" "Rosa's biscuits are adequate, but they're not..." Dorothy stopped. The admission cost her something. "They're not yours." Mabel considered this for a moment, and then, because there was no strategic advantage in refusing, and because the request was genuine, she walked Dorothy through it. The temperature of the fat, the ratio, the critical importance of barely mixing the dough, the logic of the high heat to start and the lower heat to finish. Dorothy listened with the focused attention she brought to everything, asking precise questions and repeating back the answers to confirm accuracy. When it was done, she sat for a moment with her hands on the table. "My mother was a good cook," she said. "I never learned properly. There was always..." She moved one hand in a vague gesture. "Other things." "There usually are," Mabel said. Dorothy looked at her. "Did your mother teach you?" "Most of it. The rest I picked up from necessity and from Thomas." She didn't explain who Thomas was. Dorothy didn't ask, but something in Dorothy's expression shifted, because she had ears, and she had been running the ranch for 11 years, and she knew enough about Mabel's history from the application letter that had arrived with her references 8 months ago. "I'm sorry," Dorothy said quietly. "Thank you," Mabel said, equally quietly. That was the whole of it. 2 sentences, but they were the right ones, and afterward the air in the room was different. Not lighter exactly, more like a window had been opened somewhere and a small breeze had moved through. It was in the 8th week that the first real trouble arrived. His name was Garrett, and he was not a cowboy. He dressed like one, trail coat, boots worn in the right places, hat with the proper dent, but his hands were too clean and his eyes moved the wrong way, cataloging and assessing rather than resting the way working men's eyes rest when they sit down to eat. He came in with a group of 6 riders who were legitimate drovers from an outfit heading up from the Red River, and he sat among them and ate and watched. Mabel noticed the hands first, then the eyes. She kept her attention on her work and waited. He came back the next day alone. "Remarkable place," he said, settling at the table with the ease of a man who had decided he was welcome. "Remarkable woman running it." Mabel put coffee in front of him. "Passing through?" "For the moment." He wrapped both hands around the cup. His nails were filed, she noticed, not the hands of a man who had roped or branded or dug fence post holes in the past several months. "I've been asking about this kitchen up and down the trail. Everyone has something to say about it. People like to eat. They like more than the food here, from what I hear." He looked around the room. empty at this hour, mid-morning, between breakfast and the midday meal. They talk about the woman who runs it. Say she's the best cook on any trail between Texas and Kansas. That's generous. It's what they say. He took a sip of the coffee, a slow considering sip, the kind that precedes a proposition. I represent some interests that are looking to establish a permanent eating establishment, a proper one, in Dalton City. Mabel kept her back to him, working at the stove. Is that right? Proper building, real floor, windows with glass in them, staff, a budget that would let you cook with ingredients you've probably been dreaming about since you started working out of whatever this is. She heard the slight curl in those last 3 words, whatever this is, and noted it without reaction. We're prepared to offer a significant wage, more than a cook earns, more than a head cook earns at any ranch in the territory. She turned around. She looked at him steadily, this careful, clean-handed man with his measuring eyes. What kind of interest do you represent? Business interest. What kind of business? He smiled. The profitable kind. That's not an answer. The smile held, but something behind it recalculated. I represent a group of investors who believe there's money to be made in feeding people properly. That's the whole of it. Where are they from? Various places. Who specifically? The smile went away. He set the cup down. I'm not prepared to give you names over a cup of coffee at a... He stopped himself before he repeated the phrase, but she'd heard it the first time. I can arrange a formal meeting in Dalton City. I know what Dalton City is, Mabel said. I've been through it twice. It's a cattle town with 2 saloons, a dry goods store, and a land office that's been in a legal dispute over 3 different properties for the past 4 years. The kind of investment your people make in a place like that usually has something to do with the land office rather than the eating. Garrett was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, You're smarter than people expect. Most people are, Mabel said. More coffee? He accepted the coffee, which surprised her. Then he said, The offer stands regardless of your opinion of our interests. The wage we're offering is real. The position is real. You'd be your own authority in the kitchen. I'm my own authority in this kitchen. This kitchen, he said carefully, is on someone else's property, serving someone else's hands, at someone else's schedule. He let that sit. What I'm describing is yours. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he shifted slightly in his chair, which was not something she thought he did often. Leave your name with me, she said finally. I'll think on it. He left a card. Mabel put it in her apron pocket and spent the next 2 days thinking about it, not because the offer was one she intended to accept. She had understood within 30 seconds of his second sentence that whatever his investors were actually after, it wasn't a restaurant, but because the argument at the center of it was real. The kitchen was on someone else's property. She had made it into something, but the something was sitting on ground that didn't belong to her, in a building that Harold Hale could reclaim with a morning's conversation. She had not, until Garrett sat down, with his measuring eyes and his clean hands, put this thought fully into words. She had been too busy surviving to do long-term arithmetic. But the arithmetic was there waiting for her, and she did it now in the quiet hours before the fire needed starting, lying on the inadequate cot and listening to the mice do their nightly business in the walls. What she had built was real. What she had built was not hers. That was a problem that needed solving, and it needed solving before someone else solved it for her in a way she wouldn't like. She brought it to Dutch because Dutch was the person on the ranch whose judgment she trusted most, and who was capable of thinking past the immediate situation to the one 3 steps ahead. She found him alone in the tack room on a Thursday morning, oiling a saddle with the methodical attention he gave to all things mechanical. I need to think through something, she said. Thinking room in here, Dutch said without looking up. She told him about Garrett, not all of it, but the shape of it, the what he offered and the what she suspected and the underlying question his visit had dislodged. Dutch listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand as one of his primary qualities and a rare one in working men who spent most of their days talking over each other. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, working oil into the leather. You think he's scouting. I think he's watching to see if the thing I've built here can be moved, or replicated, or used. Used how? I don't know exactly. Land, maybe. This crossing gets significant traffic. You put a permanent eating establishment here, you control who stops and who doesn't. You control the information that moves with those people. Dutch set down his oiling rag and looked at her properly. You think all that from one cup of coffee with a man in clean boots. I think a man in clean boots sitting in a trail kitchen asking about my wages has a reason for being there that isn't the food. He was quiet again. What do you want to do about it? I want to know if there's a way to make this kitchen actually mine, on paper, with whatever that requires. Dutch leaned back against the saddle rack. He looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man sorting through what he knows against what is possible. You'd have to talk to Harold. I know. Dorothy would need to agree. I know that too. It's a lot to ask. Yes. She looked at him steadily. But I've built something on this property that's worth more than what was here before. Harold knows that. Dorothy knows that. I'd like them to formally know it. Dutch picked up his rag again. He turned it over in his hands without using it. You know what you are, he said. A cook. You're a cook who thinks like a trail boss. He almost smiled. That's either real useful or a real trouble, depending on the day. She went to Harold Hale on a Friday morning, catching him between the first round of chores and whatever the day's main business was, which she knew from Skeeter was a meeting with a man from the county land office. This timing was deliberate. A man with a county meeting on his schedule was a man who had property and legal standing on his mind. And a man in that state was more likely to think clearly about the future of a piece of property than he was on a day when cattle were the only thing in his head. Harold was in the yard checking a wagon wheel when she approached. He saw her coming and had the look of a man who understood that this was not a casual visit. Miss Whitlock, he said. Mr. Hale, I'd like to talk to you about the bunkhouse kitchen. He straightened up from the wheel. He was a big man, Harold, running to heavy now that he was past 50, with a weathered face that had spent more time outdoors than in, and hands that were still a working man's hands regardless of what the bank account said. He looked at her for a moment. Go ahead, he said. She told him clearly and without elaboration what she'd built, what it was worth in practical terms to the ranch and to the trail traffic, what she suspected about Garrett and his investors, and what she needed. Not charity, not a gift, a formal agreement, a lease, a deed, something on paper that recognized what the bunkhouse kitchen had become and gave her the standing to continue building it on ground she could call her own. Harold was quiet for a long time when she finished. Long enough that she began to calculate whether she'd misjudged the timing or the approach or both. Then he said, You know Dorothy has to be part of this conversation. I know. She's not going to make it easy. She hasn't made anything easy since I arrived, Mabel said. That's not the same as impossible. Harold looked at her for another moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. A short, genuine, slightly startled sound that seemed to come from somewhere he hadn't intended to let it out of. He pressed one hand over his mouth and got it under control. No, he said, it's not the same as impossible. He looked toward the main house, in the direction of wherever Dorothy was at this moment, and his expression was complicated in the way married people's expressions are complicated when they're thinking about their spouse, and the situation is both frustrating and fond. Come to the house after supper tonight. Both of you, meaning Dorothy will know about this by then. She'll know I'm coming? She knows most things about this ranch before I do, Harold said simply. He was not wrong. When Mabel arrived at the main house that evening, Dorothy was already seated at the dining table with her hands folded on the surface in front of her, and her expression was the one she wore when she had decided something and was waiting to see if the rest of the world would have the sense to agree. But her eyes, when Mabel sat down across from her, were different from what they'd been 8 weeks ago. They were still sharp. They were still calculating. But underneath the calculation, there was something that Mabel recognized from the afternoon in the kitchen, from the biscuit lesson, from the 2 quiet sentences about Thomas. Dorothy Hale was looking at her the way you look at someone you've decided, against your original intentions, to take seriously. It was not a warm look, but it was an honest one, and honest was enough. Harold sat at the head of the table with a glass of water and the expression of a man who was prepared to referee but hoped he wouldn't have to. You want the property, Dorothy said. I want an agreement, Mabel said. There's a difference. Dorothy's chin rose slightly. Tell me the difference. Property is about ownership. An agreement is about terms. I'm not asking you to give me anything. I'm asking you to formalize what's already happening so that neither of us is at the mercy of whatever someone like Garrett decides to do next. Dorothy's eyes sharpened at the name. You've told her about Garrett, she said to Harold. She told me, Harold said. She figured it out herself. A pause. Dorothy looked at Mabel. What do you know about him? Clean hands, filed nails, eyes that were counting things the whole time he was in my kitchen. He mentioned investors and a position in Dalton City and a wage that was real but attached to interests he wouldn't name. He left a card. She put it on the table. Dorothy looked at the card without touching it. Her expression was unreadable for a moment, and then something moved through it. Recognition, or close to it. "I know the name of one of his investors," she said quietly. Harold turned to look at her. This was apparently new information to him as well. "Do you?" "He was involved in the Thornton Creek water dispute 3 years ago. He acquires land by acquiring the people who matter to the land." Dorothy looked at Mabel directly. "You matter to this crossing." The silence that followed that sentence was different from other silences. Mabel sat in it for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just been said. Not the flattery in it, because Dorothy didn't do flattery, but the tactical truth of it. She had made herself matter. She had done it deliberately, and she had done it with biscuits and beans and peach ham pies and soup broth for a sick boy who was shaking, and the result was that she had become a piece in a board she hadn't known existed. "Then we agree," she said. Dorothy's eyes had gone calculating again, but it was a different kind of calculation now, the kind where the answer at the end might be something she was willing to live with. "We'll need a lawyer," Dorothy said. "Dalton City has one," Harold offered. "Not that lawyer, the one in Emmett County." "That's a day's ride." "Yes," Dorothy said. "It is." She looked at Mabel one more time. There was something in that look, complicated and private and not entirely resolved, that Mabel understood was as close to an alliance as Dorothy Hale knew how to offer. "I'll send word on Monday." Mabel rode back to the bunkhouse kitchen in the early dark, and the stars were the kind of stars you only get on clear nights when there's no moon to compete with them. Too many to count, spread from one edge of the sky to the other. She sat on the step of the kitchen for a while before going inside, listening to the sounds the property made at night, which were different from the daytime sounds and had become, over these weeks, familiar. The mice were quiet for once. The chimney ticked as the metal cooled. Somewhere to the south, cattle were moving, some outfit settling in for the night a mile or two off. She had come here as a punishment. She had been sent to a broken-down kitchen that nobody wanted and given a supply crate that wasn't enough and left to either fail or disappear. And instead, she had built something that a man with investment money had come looking for specifically, and that a woman who had spent 11 years managing a ranch had decided was worth sending to a lawyer in Emmett County. She sat with that for a while, not triumphantly, because the work wasn't done and the situation was still complicated and Garrett's card was still in her apron pocket, but with something quieter than triumph, something more like the feeling you get when you've been walking a long time in uncertain weather and you look up and realize the sky has clarified and you can see exactly where you are. She got up from the step and went inside and started banking the fire for the morning. The lawyer's name was Herschel Prudhomme, and he operated out of a single room above the feed store in Emmett County that smelled permanently of grain dust and old paper. Dorothy rode out on a Monday as she'd said she would, taking Harold's better horse and a list of questions she'd written out by hand the night before in her precise, upright script. Mabel was not invited on this first trip, which she understood without being told. Dorothy needed to assess the train before she brought anyone else into it. She came back on Tuesday evening with a face that gave nothing away and a leather satchel that clinked faintly when she set it on the dining table. Harold and Mabel were both there. Harold had asked Mabel to come, which Dorothy had neither encouraged nor objected to, which was itself a kind of progress. "Prudhomme says a lease agreement is straightforward," Dorothy said, opening the satchel. "A deed transfer is more complicated because of how the property is registered. The bunkhouse and the surrounding yard are listed as a working outbuilding of the ranch, not a separate parcel. Separating it would require a survey and a filing with the county land office." "How long?" Harold asked. 4 to 6 weeks, if nobody contests it." "Who would contest it?" Mabel said. Dorothy looked at her. "That depends on whether Garrett's investors have already filed any kind of interest claim on this crossing." She laid a document on the table. "Prudhomme ran a check on recent filings. There's nothing yet, but yet is the operative word." Mabel looked at the document. It was dense with language she could parse only partially, but the structure of it was clear enough. "So we file first." "We file first," Dorothy confirmed. "And we file a lease in the interim, so that your position here has legal standing while the deed transfer processes." Harold nodded slowly. He was looking at his wife with an expression that combined respect and something like relief, as if he'd been hoping she would handle this part, and she had. "There's one more thing," Dorothy said. She put her hands flat on the table on either side of the document. This was a gesture Mabel had come to recognize as the one she made when she was about to say something that cost her. "Prudhomme asked who would be the guarantor on the lease. He needs a property owner's signature as co-party until the deed transfers." The room was quiet. "I'll sign it," Dorothy said. "My name on the lease with yours, until the deed is finalized." Mabel looked at her. She thought about what this meant. Dorothy Hale putting her legal name on a document that formalized Mabel's right to a building on the property Dorothy ran, a building that Dorothy had assigned as punishment 10 weeks ago. Why? Mabel asked, not to be difficult, because she genuinely wanted to know what calculation had produced this outcome. Dorothy's face did the thing where it opened slightly, that warped door quality before it caught itself. Because Garrett's people are coming whether we're ready or not, and the only way to make this crossing something they can't simply buy or bully is to make its principal asset legally secured. She paused. You are the principal asset. It was not a warm speech, but it was an honest one, and from Dorothy Hale, honest was considerable. The lease was signed the following Friday, witnessed by Harold and Dutch, and recorded at Emmett County Courthouse the week after. Prudhomme sent a copy to the land office in Dalton City as a matter of procedure. Whether Garrett's investors saw it, Mabel didn't know. She didn't hear from Garrett again, which she took as either a good sign or the sign that he was waiting for something. In the meantime, the kitchen kept going. It had to, because the trail season was at its full running height now, late summer pushing toward fall, and the outfits moving north were larger and more frequent than they'd been in the spring. Some days she fed 30 men between sunrise and midday. Some days it was fewer, 8 or 10, but they were men who'd been on the trail for weeks, and their hunger was a substantial thing. Not just physical, but the hunger for something that wasn't jerky and hardtack and creek water that tasted of mud. She had by now refined her system to something approaching efficiency. The bean pot ran continuously, the base refreshed, and the flavor built on over days in the way a good pot of beans always deepens when it isn't started fresh every morning. She made bread 3 times a week on baking days and kept it wrapped and distributed it in portions that stretched the supply without anyone feeling shorted. Coffee was the one thing she kept unlimited, because coffee was the currency of goodwill on the frontier, and a man who'd had enough coffee was a man in a manageable state. She had also, quietly, begun keeping records. Not formal ledgers, she didn't have the materials for that yet, but a small notebook she'd bought on credit from the dry goods store in Dalton City, passed to her by Skeeter on one of the Saturday mail runs. In it, she tracked what she used, what she spent, what came in from Dorothy's deliveries versus what she sourced through the Saturday supply runs that Dutch's informal network had established. She tracked who came through, not by name usually, but by outfit size and rough origin, because she had begun to understand that the traffic through this crossing followed patterns that were predictable if you paid attention, and predictable traffic was something you could plan around. Dutch found her at this notebook one evening and stood reading over her shoulder for a moment before she noticed him. "You're keeping books," he said. "I'm keeping track." "That's books." He looked at a page. "That's a real business record." "I know what it is." He pulled out the bench across from her and sat down. "You talked to Prudhomme about a formal business filing?" "Not yet. Might be worth it. If this place is going to be yours on paper, it should be on all the papers." Mabel looked at him across the table. He was a man who, in another life, in another set of circumstances, might have been something other than a ranch foreman. He had a precision about him that went beyond cattle, a way of thinking and systems and consequences that she'd noticed from the first week. She had wondered more than once what road had brought him to Red Cedar, but she'd never asked because asking that question on the frontier was generally considered impolite and often counterproductive. "How do you know about business filings?" she asked. Dutch was quiet for a moment. "Had a different life before this one," he said. She didn't push it. "I'll write to Prudhomme," she said. "Good." He stood up from the bench. "And Mabel," he paused at the door, "whatever Garrett is, he's not the last one. You build something real out here, people are going to come for it. You need it locked down tight before the ones who know how to take things get organized." She knew he was right. She also knew something he might not have fully reckoned with, which was that the locking down process had its own complications that legal documents couldn't entirely address. The bunkhouse kitchen's value was not the building or the location or even the food, though the food was considerable. The value was the atmosphere, and that was not a thing you could file at a county courthouse. It existed in the specific calibration of how she ran the room, who she fed without question, how she managed the difficult men, the way she moved between the stove and the table, the decisions she made in the half second between one thing and the next about when to be warm and when to be firm and when to be completely silent and let the coffee do the work. If someone took the building and put a different cook in it, they would have a building and a stove and a location at a river crossing. They would not have what Mabel had built. But what Mabel had built was not a thing she could defend in court, and that was the gap between the reality and the legal record that kept her up some nights. It was on a Wednesday morning in the 9th week during the quiet period between the breakfast rush and the midday meal that the first of the 4 trail bosses arrived. His name was Amos Ritter, and he was 54 years old and had been driving cattle from Texas to Kansas for 22 of those years, which meant he had survived more trail seasons than most men tried and had developed in that time, a reputation that preceded him through every cattle town, every railhead, and every river crossing between the Red River and Abilene. He was not a large man. Medium height, lean in the way men who work outdoors in all weather go lean, with hands that were permanently stained dark from years of rope and leather. He had eyes that were dark and patient and assessed everything they landed on with the same unhurried thoroughness. He came in alone, which was unusual for a trail boss on a working drive. He tied his horse himself, which Mabel saw through the window as she was cleaning up the breakfast dishes, and he stood outside for a moment looking at the building before he came through the door. He sat down at the table and looked at the room the way people look at rooms when they're comparing what they see to what they've been told. "Coffee?" Mabel said. "Please." His voice was low and slightly rough, the voice of a man who spent most of his days outdoors. He waited until she'd set the cup in front of him before he spoke again. "You're Miss Whitlock." "I am." "I've heard about this kitchen from 3 different outfits, Carson and 2 others." He looked at the cup. "Carson doesn't recommend things he hasn't personally verified. Said the coffee alone was worth the detour." "That's kind of him." She went back to her dishes. "I'm not here about the coffee," Ritter said. She kept her hands in the wash water. "No?" "I run the Ritter outfit. 22 men, 4,000 head, moving north for the fall market. We've been taking the same route for 8 years. He paused. "The cook I've had for 6 of those years is going back to his family in Missouri at the end of this drive. His wife wrote him a letter that changed his mind about the frontier." Mabel turned around. Ritter was looking at her directly now with those patient eyes. "I'm not going to tell you what I'm offering before I've eaten something. I was raised to know that a negotiation over food is more honest than one without it." She almost smiled at that. She put bread and the remains of the morning's bean pot in front of him and let him eat, and she finished her dishes, and the kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the sound of the ranch going about its business outside the walls. When he was done, he set the spoon down and leaned back and said, "That's the best trail food I've had in 22 years. "It's not trail food," she said. "That's the point." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said slowly. "That is exactly the point." He reached into his coat and set an envelope on the table. "My offer. In writing, because I've been told you're a woman who thinks in documents." She picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. "Who told you that?" "Dutch. He said the name the way people say the name of someone they've known a long time. He and I worked together before Red Cedar, 7 years ago." She set the envelope down. This was new information, and she filed it carefully. Dutch's history, the network of people that connected these outfits across the territory, the way Ritter knowing Dutch meant he had come here knowing considerably more about the situation than a casual recommendation from Carson would have produced. "You could have written," she said, "I wanted to see the kitchen for myself." "And?" Ritter looked around the room one more time. The pine table, the swept floor, the stove running clean. The window with its oilcloth gone now. She'd managed to get glass in 2 of the 4 frames, paid for out of her own supply funds and installed by Skeeter and Webb on a Sunday afternoon with a lot of cursing and 1 small cut that had required bandaging. "What I heard didn't do it justice," he said, "and what I heard was considerable." She put the envelope in her apron pocket without opening it. "I'll think on it." "I'll be at the South Crossing with the herd for 2 days. If you want to come see the outfit before you decide, you're welcome." He stood up and put money on the table. Not the amount of a meal, considerably more, and she looked at it. "I said it was on the house," she said. "And I said the coffee was worth the detour," he replied, and went out the door. She opened the envelope that evening after supper, sitting on the step in the last light. The offer was written in the direct, unglamorous language of a man who negotiated cattle contracts, the wage, the terms, the duration, the provisions regarding her authority over the kitchen operations. She read it twice. The wage was real. The terms were reasonable. The authority clause was the kind that a man who had run a large outfit for 22 years would include because he understood that a cook who didn't control their own kitchen produced worse food, which cost him money. It was a practical document from a practical man, and it was generous. She folded it back into the envelope and held it in both hands and sat there while the light went from orange to purple to dark. She thought about the lease in the courthouse at Emmett County. She thought about the notebook full of records on the table inside. She thought about the crack in the stove's firebox that she'd repacked twice now and would need to pack again before winter, and the mice that had finally, mostly, retreated to wherever mice retreat when they've been persistently discouraged, and the 2 glass windows she'd replaced with her own money, and the pine table that someone had carved up with pocket knives and that she had sanded smooth on the worst sections during a slow Sunday 3 weeks ago. She thought about Thomas. Not with the acute, wincing grief of the first year, but with the quieter ache of now, the fact of his absence rather than the shock of it. He would have liked Ritter, she thought. He would have liked the directness. She thought about what Dutch had said. Whatever Garrett is, he's not the last one. She went inside and banked the fire and put the envelope in the notebook and went to sleep. The second trail boss arrived 2 days after Ritter. His name was Frank Beaumont, and he was everything Ritter was not. Loud, broad, with a laugh you could hear from the corral, and a way of taking up space that suggested he had never seriously considered the possibility that space was finite. He came through the door at the head of a crew of 14 and immediately began rearranging the seating arrangement to accommodate his preferred position at the head of the table, which he did without malice, but also without asking. In the way of a man who has spent his whole life in rooms that rearrange themselves around him. Mabel watched this from the stove. Dutch watched it from his end of the table with an expression of careful neutrality. Beaumont sat down, looked around, said, "This is smaller than I expected," and then looked at Mabel and said, "You don't look like what I pictured." "What did you picture?" she said. He considered this with genuine thought rather than immediate backpedaling. "Taller," he decided, "sterner. I'm stern when it's useful." He laughed, the big, room-filling laugh, and it was, she noted, genuinely warm rather than performed. "I like that answer." He leaned forward with both elbows on the table. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Whitlock. I came here because 3 men I respect told me you were the best cook operating between here and the railheads, and in my experience, the best cook is worth more to a cattle drive than the second best cowboy. My offer is, after you've eaten," she said. He blinked, then he grinned. "Fair enough." He ate with the enormous appetite of a large man who had been doing physical labor since dawn, which was nearly everything she had in the pot, and he ate it all with the cheerful thoroughness of someone who had no complicated relationship with food or with enjoying it. He complimented the bread by saying, "This is good bread," with the straightforward certainty of a man whose instincts were reliable if unpoetic. He drank 3 cups of coffee. When he was done, he pushed the plate back and said, "My offer is better than whatever Ritter gave you." Mabel looked at him. "How do you know Ritter gave me anything?" "Because Ritter's been trying to replace Cookie Marsh since the letters started coming from Missouri, and because the trail between here and Abilene is a small world, and everyone knows everyone's business." He wasn't bothered by this. He said it the way you state a geographical fact. "He's offering you the cook job. I'm offering you something different." "Tell me." "Partner." He said it simply. "My outfit is expanding. We're setting up a permanent base camp operation at the Cimarron Crossing. Not just a drive, a year-round cattle management operation. We need a kitchen that functions as a genuine commissary. I'm not looking for a hired cook. I'm looking for someone to run the food operation as a partner enterprise. Profit share. Your name on the business." Mabel was very still. "Why?" "Because a hired cook has half the investment in the outcome that a partner does. And because the trail bosses who've eaten here tell me you're not just cooking, you're managing supplies, relationships, the whole operation. And that's a partner, not an employee." She looked at him for a moment. "Who else have you talked to besides Ritter?" "Carson. And a man named Garrett, though I did not like what he had to say and told him so." The name landed in the room like a stone in a still pool. "What did he say?" Beaumont's easy expression shifted, not to hostility, but to the careful look of a man who has decided to be accurate rather than diplomatic. He said this kitchen was a temporary enterprise on someone else's property run by a woman who didn't have the standing to make it permanent, and that the smart play was to wait it out. A pause. "I told him the smart play was usually whatever the person actually on the ground was doing, and that from what I'd heard, what you were doing was considerable." "Did you know about the lease filing?" "I did not." His eyes sharpened with interest. "Tell me." She told him the outline of it, the Prudhomme conversation, the deed transfer in progress, the lease with Dorothy's name on it. She didn't tell him about the notebook or the records or the details of the financial picture because that was not information she was ready to put in the hands of a man she'd met an hour ago, however straightforwardly he presented himself. Beaumont listened with the total attention of a man who processed information through his gut as much as his head. When she finished, he said, "Garrett's going to move when he finds that out." "I know." "When does the deed transfer finalize?" 4 to 6 weeks from the filing, maybe 3 weeks from now. "That's a window." He looked at the room, the ceiling, back at her. "My offer stands regardless, but I'd suggest moving that filing along as fast as Prudhomme can manage it." It was not a threat and not quite advice. It was the observation of a man who understood timelines and how they could be compressed or exploited by people with the resources to do either. After Beaumont's crew rode out, Mabel sent a letter to Prudhomme by the next day's mail rider asking what could be done to accelerate the deed transfer timeline. She wrote 2 drafts and kept the second, which was direct and brief and contained all the relevant information and none of the anxiety she was feeling, because anxiety in a letter was not something you could take back. The third trail boss came while she was still waiting for Prudhomme's reply. His name was Lee Cutter, and he was the quietest of the 3 by a considerable margin. He arrived in the early morning before the breakfast rush had fully resolved, a single rider on a good horse, and he sat at the corner of the table and ate without drawing attention to himself, and then sat a while longer with his coffee after the other men had gone, and if Mabel hadn't been paying attention, she might have taken him for an ordinary passing drover. She was paying attention. "You're not from one of the outfits that stopped here before," she said, refilling his cup without being asked. "No." He was 40, maybe 45, with a quiet face and hands that had the specific wear of a man who managed other people's labor rather than doing the roughest of it himself. Not clean like Garrett's hands, used but differently. "My outfit doesn't come through this crossing usually. We work the eastern route." "Then someone told you to come specifically." "Beaumont." He said the name without inflection. "He and I have known each other 20 years. He sent a rider." She looked at him. "He sent you a rider." Said there was a woman at the Red Cedar Crossing who needed to know that Garrett Plum's investors had filed a competing interest claim on the station property at this crossing. He met her eyes directly. "Filed it in Dalton City 2 days ago." The information hit her with the cold clarity of something she'd been expecting and had not fully prepared for despite the expectation. She set the coffee pot down on the table and stood with her hands on either side of it. "The station property," she said, "not the bunkhouse. The old trail station on the north side of the crossing, the one that's been empty for 6 years." He paused. "You know it." She knew it. She had looked at it, actually, walked past it more than once in the weeks since Dorothy's letter to Prudhomme, thinking about what it would take to make it usable, whether the structure had enough left in it to be worth building on. A stone foundation, she'd noted, better than the bunkhouse, and situated right at the crossing itself where the traffic was densest. She had not moved on it because the legal process for the bunkhouse had been consuming all the available attention, legal and financial, and because she had not yet wanted to overreach before the first thing was secured. Garrett's investors had made no such conservative calculation. "They're claiming abandoned property rights," Cutter said. "It's a legitimate legal mechanism if the filing holds. They'd have a building at the crossing with legal standing that could be established before your deed on the bunkhouse finalizes. And if they establish first, they control the crossing. Your kitchen is still yours, but it's behind their building on the secondary road, and every outfit coming north stops at the first thing they see with a legal establishment marker on it." He watched her face. "You understand what that means for your business." She understood it precisely. A kitchen behind a legal establishment at a major crossing was a kitchen that depended on the generosity of the establishment in front of it for its traffic. And generosity was not something Garrett's investors had demonstrated any aptitude for. "When did you say the filing was?" she said. 2 days ago." "How long to contest it?" Cutter looked at her with a slight, careful expression that was as close to admiration as a man of his type was likely to show a woman he'd known for under an hour. "That's the right question," he said. "Prudhomme's office would know the specific window, but in my experience with Dalton City's land office, you have approximately 2 weeks from a competing filing to raise a challenge before it's formally accepted." 2 weeks. The deed transfer was 3 weeks from completion, maybe more. She thought about the gap between 2 weeks and 3. She thought about Garrett's clean hands and his measuring eyes and the card she'd thrown away after Dorothy had looked at it. "Why did Beaumont send you?" she said. "He could have sent this in a letter." Cutter was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a small, thoughtful motion. "Because Beaumont believes in doing things directly when they matter. And because..." He paused again in a way that suggested he was choosing the next part carefully. Because my outfit has been looking for a permanent kitchen base at this crossing for 2 seasons. We've been working the eastern route because there was nothing suitable on the western one. If this crossing becomes properly established legally and commercially, it changes our routing." He looked at her. "I have a personal interest in seeing Garrett's claim fail." She sat down across from him. This was the third offer in less than a week, and it was structured differently from the other 2. Not a job, not a partnership in an existing enterprise, but something that had its own angle that she was still working out. "What are you proposing, sis say?" "Resources," he said simply. "Legal and financial. My outfit's lawyer knows Dalton City's land office better than Prudhomme does. He's dealt with this specific type of competing claim before, and he knows where the weaknesses are in Garrett's filing." He set the cup down. "In exchange, when your station is established, and I believe it will be with the right handling, I want a formal supply agreement. My outfit stops here every season, pre-agreed rate, priority table service during drives." "A supply agreement isn't ownership," she said. "No," his voice was level. "It's a business relationship, which is what I'm proposing. Not charity, not a takeover, a business relationship between 2 operations that benefit each other." Mabel sat with this for a moment. Outside, the ranch was going about its mid-morning business. She could hear Skeeter and Webb doing something noisy with the water barrel. She could hear the hum of the trail in the distance. Cattle, horses, the low, continuous sound of a frontier that didn't pause for any individual situation. "I need to talk to Dorothy," she said. "Of course," Cutter said. He reached into his coat and put a card on the table. "This one's my lawyer, not me. No investor interests attached to it." He stood. "I'll be at the Eastern Crossing until Friday." He left his payment, which was exact and fair, and walked out to his horse and rode east. Mabel sat at the table for a while after he left, looking at his lawyer's card and Ritter's envelope and the notebook full of records and the window with its new glass and the stove with its repacked firebox and the swept floor and the walls that still had mouse damage she hadn't gotten to yet. She thought about Thomas again. Not the ache this time. Something more specific. The particular memory of him saying, once, during a stretch of bad luck in the 2nd year of their marriage when 3 things had gone wrong in sequence, and she'd been sitting with the feeling of being overwhelmed. The problems aren't the problem, Mabel. The problem is doing them one at a time instead of all at once. She'd argued with him at the time. She'd said you couldn't do them all at once. That was the whole nature of the problem. He'd said you couldn't do them sequentially either. That was the whole nature of time. They'd gone around this for an hour and then made coffee and decided to sleep on it. And in the morning, she'd woken up with the shape of the solution in her head because somewhere in the night, her mind had worked out what both of them had been trying to say. You couldn't do them all at once, but you could move on all of them simultaneously with enough hands. She got up and went to find Dutch. He was in the corral, which was where she usually found him when she needed him, and he was not surprised to see her coming. She had noticed that about him from the beginning. He was rarely surprised by anything, which she suspected product of his previous life, or a character trait so fundamental it preceded any particular experience. She told him everything. Ritter's offer, Beaumont's warning, and Cutter's intelligence, and the competing claim in Dalton City. She laid it out in the sequence it had happened, and Dutch stood with his arms on the top rail and listened without interrupting, and his face showed her nothing while she talked. When she was done, there was a silence that lasted long enough that a lesser person might have filled it prematurely. Mabel waited. "Garrett moved faster than I expected," Dutch said finally. "You expected him to move." "Yes. You didn't tell me. I told you they'd come for it when it was worth coming for. I didn't know the specific play." He turned away from the rail and looked at her. "The station property is the move I would have made in his position. It's clean. Legally clean, I mean. The abandoned property filing is a legitimate mechanism, difficult to challenge if it holds." Cutter says his lawyer knows the weaknesses. Dutch nodded slowly. "Cutter's lawyer is a man named Aldridge. I've heard the name. He's good." "You know everyone on this trail." "I've been on it a long time." He looked toward the horizon where the trail came in from the south, a line of dust that was always somewhere on clear days. The 3 of them coming inside a week is not coincidence. "I know." She had been thinking about this since Cutter left. Carson told Ritter. Ritter talked to Beaumont. Beaumont sent Cutter and also sent a rider to Ritter to say he'd been here, which is how Ritter knew Beaumont had made a competing offer. And someone in that chain found out about Garrett's filing. She paused. Or Garrett wanted them to know. Wanted me to feel the pressure of the clock. Dutch looked at her. "That's a sophisticated read. Is it wrong?" He considered. "Probably not entirely. Garrett's smart enough to use the offer pressure as a separate kind of leverage. If he thinks you're likely to leave with one of the 3 outfits, the station filing becomes a backup position. He gets the crossing even if he can't get you. He picked up a length of rope from the fence post. But if he thinks you're going to stay and fight the filing, the clock is real. He's counting on you not having the right legal resources fast enough. Which is where Cutter's offer becomes relevant. Yes, Dutch turned the rope in his hands. What did you promise him? Nothing yet. I said I needed to talk to Dorothy. Dutch nodded. Dorothy's going to want to see the competing claim filing herself before she agrees to anything involving Cutter's lawyer. I know. I'm going to her tonight. Good. He paused. And Ritter's offer. And Beaumont's. I'm not taking either of them. She said it simply, without drama, because it wasn't dramatic. It was just a fact she had arrived at somewhere between Cutter riding east and finding Dutch in the corral. She was not going to leave this kitchen. She had not built it to leave it. She had built it because it was the thing she had to build, and it was here, and it was beginning to be hers. In all the ways that mattered, and she was not going to hand it to anyone because the timeline was pressing. Dutch looked at her for a moment. He almost said something and then didn't. What he did instead was put his hand briefly on her shoulder. One quick, firm, awkward gesture, the gesture of a man who rarely did such things and had decided that this was the moment to do one anyway. And then he went back to the fence and the rope. She stood there for a second. Then she turned around and went to the kitchen and started preparing for the evening meal because the evening meal was in 4 hours and she had 20 men to feed and a conversation with Dorothy to get through afterward and a letter to write to Prudhomme that couldn't wait until morning. The mice were quiet. The stove was drawing clean. Through the new glass of the western window, the late afternoon sun came in at an angle that hit the pine table and made the old wood look almost golden. She put on her apron and got to work. Dorothy did not say anything for a long time after Mabel finished laying it out. She sat at the dining table with her hands folded and her eyes on the middle distance, and her face doing the thing it did when she was moving pieces around an internal board that nobody else could see. Harold was there too, at the end of the table, and he had the good sense to stay quiet. Mabel had come straight from the kitchen after the evening meal, still with flour on her apron that she hadn't bothered to change out of because the letter to Prudhomme was sitting half written on the work table, and the clock on Garrett's competing claim was 2 days old already, and every hour she spent on anything other than moving felt like a concession she hadn't agreed to make. Show me the filing, Dorothy said finally. I don't have it. Cutter described it. His lawyer has seen it. Cutter's lawyer has seen it, Dorothy repeated, not skeptical exactly, precise. Yes. And Cutter wants a supply agreement in exchange for his lawyer's involvement in contesting the claim. That's what he proposed. Dorothy looked at Harold. Harold looked at her. Something passed between them that was too married and too private to read from the outside. The station property, Dorothy said, turning back to Mabel. Garrett's investors filed on the old trail station. Yes, not the bunkhouse. The bunkhouse is already in the filing process. The station is the adjacent angle. Mabel put her hands flat on the table, the same gesture Dorothy used when she was about to say something that cost her. If they hold the station, they hold the crossing. My kitchen becomes secondary. The traffic goes to whatever they put in that building first. Dorothy was quiet again. Then she said something that surprised Mabel entirely. I looked at that station 2 years ago. Harold turned to her. You didn't tell me that. I was thinking about it. It's a stone foundation. Sound walls. The roof needed replacing, but the structure was solid. She paused. I decided the investment wasn't justified at the time. The crossing traffic wasn't consistent enough to support a second establishment on the property. It's consistent now, Mabel said. Dorothy's eyes came back to her. Because of you. It wasn't a warm statement. It was a straight acknowledgement of cause and effect stated the way Dorothy stated most things, which was directly and without decoration. The consistency exists, Mabel said. The question is who holds the station when the deed finalizes. Dorothy sat with this for a moment. Then she unfolded her hands and put them flat on the table in a different arrangement. Not the before something costly gesture, a different one, more open. I'm going to tell you something I have not told Harold. She glanced at her husband briefly. Or rather, something I have not told Harold fully. Harold's expression indicated this was not an uncommon situation, and that he had made peace with it. The investor group Garrett represents, I know more about it than I let on when you brought me the card, Dorothy said. "The man I mentioned, the one from the Thornton Creek water dispute. His name is Marcus Veal. He operates through intermediaries. Garrett is one of 3 I'm aware of. He doesn't acquire land directly. He acquires the people whose presence makes land valuable, and when he can't acquire them, he acquires the position around them and waits." Mabel looked at her steadily. "How do you know this?" Dorothy pressed her lips together for a moment. "Because he tried to acquire Red Cedar 4 years ago. Not the land. Harold." She said her husband's name in a careful, level voice. "He approached Harold with a partnership offer on the cattle operation. The terms were generous on the surface and structured to give Veal's group controlling interest within 3 years." She paused. Harold turned it down. Harold, to his credit, did not look embarrassed. He looked tired. "I should have told you sooner," he said to Mabel, "when you brought Garrett's card." "Why didn't you?" Mabel said. "Because I wasn't certain it was the same group, and because—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "Because if it was the same group, it meant they'd found another way into this crossing through you, and that was partly my doing, for sending you to that kitchen in the first place." The room was very quiet. Mabel thought about this. The full shape of it. The way things that seem like separate events turn out to be part of the same movement. The way she had been sent to the bunkhouse kitchen as a punishment for a small act of decency, and had built something in it that had attracted the exact kind of attention that Harold's earlier decision had refused. The same water finding a different crack in the same wall. "Veal's group is patient," Dorothy said. "They waited 4 years after Harold turned them down before they moved on this crossing. They waited for something to appear that made the crossing worth the investment of a serious legal strategy." She looked at Mabel without apology, but with something close to it. "You made it worth the investment." "I know," Mabel said. "Cutter's lawyer. Do you know if he's dealt with Veal specifically, or just the type of claim?" "Dutch thinks Aldridge has dealt with Veal's type. He wasn't specific." Dorothy nodded. She stood up from the table and went to the writing desk in the corner. A small, careful desk that held her ledgers and correspondence in a system so organized, it had always slightly intimidated Mabel on the few occasions she'd seen it, and she opened the lower drawer and took out a folder that was thicker than a casual document. She brought it to the table and opened it. Inside were papers, letters, filed documents, what appeared to be copies of legal correspondence, organized by date. "Everything I kept from the Veal approach 4 years ago," Dorothy said. "Prudhomme should see this, and Cutter's lawyer should see it. If Veal's group is operating the same way they did with Harold, there are procedural vulnerabilities in how they establish the initial interest claim. They rely on the other party not having documentation of prior conduct." Mabel looked at the folder, then at Dorothy. "You kept all of this." "I keep everything," Dorothy said simply. Harold made a sound that was approximately a laugh. "She does," he confirmed. "You were prepared for this," Mabel said. Not an accusation. Recognition. Dorothy sat back down. "I was prepared for the possibility. There's a difference." She closed the folder. "I'll ride to Prudhomme tomorrow morning. Early. I want to be in his office before midday." She looked at Mabel. "Write your letter tonight. I'll take it with me." Mabel nodded. She stood up from the table and was at the door when Dorothy said, "One more thing." She turned. Dorothy's hands were on the folder. Her expression had the quality of a door that was fully open now rather than just ajar, and it was an expression that didn't entirely suit her face because her face was not built for openness and it showed. "I want you to know that I am aware of what I did, sending you to that kitchen, the reason I did it." She stopped, started again. "The reason was not what I said it was. You know that." "I know," Mabel said. "I wanted you to leave." The words came out even and flat, the way Dorothy said things she had decided to say, regardless of the cost. "You walked in here, and within a week every man on this property looked at you the way they have never looked at me in 11 years. I have run this ranch with precision and fairness, and I have earned their respect and their compliance, and I have never—" Her voice held barely. "I wanted you to leave because your presence made me feel something I am not accustomed to feeling." "Small," Mabel said quietly. Dorothy's chin came up. "Yes." The words sat in the room. Mabel stood at the door and looked at this woman who had made her first weeks here a deliberate trial, and who was now, at some personal cost that was evident in every careful, controlled line of her face, saying the true thing out loud. "I know what that feels like," Mabel said. "I've been made to feel it most of my life." She paused. "It doesn't get easier, but you get better at knowing it's not the truth." Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. Her jaw was set and her eyes were bright in a way that was not tears exactly, but was the thing that happens before someone decides whether to let tears happen or not. She decided not to, which was, Mabel thought, exactly what Dorothy Hale would do. "Good night, Miss Whitlock," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Hale." Mabel opened the door. "Thank you for the folder." She walked back to the bunkhouse kitchen in the dark and finished the letter to Prudhomme by candlelight and went to sleep with the sense of something having shifted in a way that wasn't dramatic but was permanent. She rode out the next morning to find Cutter before Dorothy reached Prudhomme because the sequencing mattered. She needed Cutter to know about Dorothy's folder before Aldridge assessed the filing challenge, because if Aldridge went in without that context, he would be building a case on incomplete information, and the case would be weaker for it. Skeeter saddled her horse without comment, which indicated Dutch had spoken to him. She rode east on the trail that Cutter had taken the previous afternoon, following it to the secondary crossing 2 miles out, where the eastern route split from the main trail, and she found the Cutter outfit's camp on the flat ground beyond the creek. Tents, horses on a line, a cook fire that was producing breakfast for 15 men. Cutter was at the fire when she rode in. He looked up and did not appear surprised, which she was beginning to think was simply how Cutter looked at everything. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "I need to talk to Aldridge today," she said, dismounting. "Before your offer has been accepted or declined, there's information he needs to have before he builds the challenge." Cutter poured her a cup from the camp pot without being asked. It was bad coffee. Trail coffee, no offense to the camp cook who was doing what could be done with limited supplies. And she drank it because declining it would have been a statement she didn't intend to make. "Tell me," he said. She told him about Veal and Dorothy's folder. She gave him the outline only, the Thornton Creek history, the approach to Harold, the documentation Dorothy had kept, and what it potentially meant for the procedural foundation of Garrett's filing. Cutter listened with his coffee cup in both hands and his eyes slightly narrowed. "Aldridge needs to see that folder," he said when she finished. "That's why I'm here. Dorothy is willing to share it. She's taking it to Prudhomme this morning. If Aldridge and Prudhomme work together, both of them see it." Cutter was quiet for a moment. He looked at the creek, the way it moved over the rocks at the crossing, the trail marks on both banks where years of cattle drives had worn the ground down. "You understand that if Aldridge and Prudhomme are working from the same documentation, the fee structure gets complicated. 2 lawyers are not twice the price of one usually, but they're not simple." "I know." She had thought about this on the ride out. "Cutter, I need to know something before I agree to any legal involvement from your side. Beaumont said Garrett came to him. He turned Garrett down. Did Garrett come to you?" Cutter looked at her directly. His face was calm and careful in the way of a man who understood that the next thing he said would determine whether this conversation continued or ended. "No," he said. "Garrett didn't come to me. But Veal's group approached someone in my network 6 months ago about the eastern crossing. Different property, same mechanism." He paused. "I recognized the pattern when Beaumont sent the rider. And your interest in the supply agreement is exactly what I said it was. My outfit needs this crossing. The eastern route is longer and harder on the cattle. This crossing cuts 2 days off the drive and the water is better." He set his cup down. "I'm not Veal, Miss Whitlock. I'm a man who sees an opportunity to do business with someone who is clearly competent and who has built something worth doing business with. That's all." She looked at him for a long moment, reading what she could of his face against what she'd learned about how men presented themselves when they wanted something. He was not Garrett. There was no performance in his stillness, no calculated arrangement of words. But he was not disinterested either, and she had learned enough in the past weeks to know that disinterested was not the same thing as honest. Interested could be honest too, if the interest was in what it claimed to be. "I'll talk to Dorothy about the legal coordination," she said. "If Prudhomme and Aldridge can work together on the filing challenge, I'll send word to you today." He nodded. "And the supply agreement." "When the deed is finalized," she said. "Not before. I'm not making permanent agreements on property I don't own yet." Something in his expression settled. Not relief, more like confirmation of something he'd already assessed. "Fair," he said. She rode back to the ranch and found Dutch and told him the full picture, which she had not done the night before because there hadn't been time. He listened in the corral again, with his arms on the top rail, and when she was finished, he said, "Ritter needs to know about Veal." "Why Ritter?" "Because Ritter and Veal have history that I didn't mention before because it wasn't my information to give." He turned to look at her. "Ritter lost a trail station to Veal's group 7 years ago. Station on the Cimarron. That's partly why he runs the route he runs now. The original route ran through that station, and after Veal took it, Ritter had to reroute. He paused. If Ritter knows Veal is behind this, he's not going to sit at the South Crossing waiting for your answer. Mabel stared at him. You knew about Ritter and Veal. I knew they had history. I didn't know Veal was behind Garrett until you told me about Dorothy's folder. He met her eyes. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned the Ritter connection earlier. Yes, she said. You should have. She said it without anger, because Dutch was not a man who withheld things carelessly, and whatever reason he'd had for the delay was probably a considered one, even if the consideration had come out wrong. Send word to Ritter. Today. Already planning on it. He paused. Beaumont too? Beaumont already knows about Veal in some form. He mentioned the Thornton Creek dispute to me indirectly. He's been watching this group, she thought. Tell Ritter. Let Beaumont know Ritter's been contacted. They'll put the rest together. Dutch sent word to Ritter that afternoon by one of the younger hands who rode the South Trail regularly and could cover the 2 miles to the creek crossing in under 30 minutes. He sent a separate message to Beaumont's camp, which was further out on the northern trail where the big outfit had bedded for another day before pushing on. Mabel spent the afternoon managing the kitchen, feeding a midday rush of 12, 2 of whom were new men from an outfit she hadn't seen before. Quiet men who ate without conversation and paid exactly and rode on. She watched them go with the careful attention she brought to anyone who didn't fit the established pattern, but they were only drovers, tired and hungry and moving, with nothing more complicated behind their eyes than the distance remaining between where they were and where they were going. Prudhomme's reply came back with Dorothy late that afternoon. Dorothy rode in looking less composed than she usually did after a day in the saddle, which meant the Emmett County trip had been substantive rather than routine. She came to the bunkhouse kitchen directly, which in itself was a signal. Prudhomme reviewed the competing claims, she said, sitting down at the table. She had been doing this more lately, sitting at the kitchen table, and Mabel had stopped noting it as unusual because it had become something else. It's a legitimate abandoned property filing, but there are 2 procedural irregularities in how the abandonment was established. Veal's lawyers did the research on the property, but missed a prior claim filing from 9 years ago that wasn't properly discharged. It's in the county record, but it requires pulling the original survey documents, which Prudhomme is doing now. That's the vulnerability, Mabel said. One of them. Prudhomme wants to see Aldridge's assessment before he files the challenge. He says 2 independent reads on the same filing will be stronger than 1. Dorothy put her hands on the table. He also said something I want to tell you directly because I think you need to hear it from me rather than from him. Mabel looked at her. He said that the bunkhouse deed transfer can be accelerated if there's a documented commercial operation already functioning on the property. The commercial operation has to be registered, formally, with the county business office. Dorothy held her gaze. Your notebook, the records you've been keeping. They're not formal records. They're a foundation. Prudhomme says with a proper business registration and a formatted version of what's in the notebook, the deed transfer could move in 10 days rather than 3 weeks. 10 days versus 3 weeks. The gap between 2 and 3 weeks had been the problem. 10 days collapsed that gap entirely. Mabel sat down. She felt the significance of this, the way you feel a change in elevation. Not immediately, but as a shift in pressure, a difference in what breathing required. What does the registration require, she said. A business name, a formal description of the operation, the financial records in a standard format, and a fee. Dorothy paused. $12. It was not a large amount in absolute terms. It was a specific and real amount when you were a woman running a kitchen on a borrowed property with a supply budget managed by someone else's ledger. Mabel did the arithmetic in her head against what she had in the tin box under the cot where she kept her personal savings. 4 months of small wages paid by Harold for the kitchen operation, carefully preserved because she had been treating every dollar as a future brick in something she hadn't been able to fully name yet. I have it, she said. Good. Dorothy looked at the notebook on the table. May I see it? Mabel passed it across. Dorothy opened it and read with the focused attention she brought to ledgers, turning pages without haste, occasionally going back to reread something. Mabel watched her face and saw the moment Dorothy understood what the notebook actually was. Not just records, but a complete picture of an operation, supply chains and traffic patterns and cost structures and customer relationships documented in the compressed, precise shorthand of someone who had been thinking like a businesswoman without having the language to call it that. You built this from scratch, Dorothy said, not out loud to Mabel. almost to herself. The kitchen? The system. Dorothy turned another page. This is a business plan. You didn't set out to write one, but this is what it is. She closed the notebook and looked up. Prudhomme can work from this. He'll need it formalized. Column structure, totals, dated entries, and sequence. But the substance is here. How long to format it? An evening's work for someone who knows ledgers. Dorothy's eyes held something that was not quite an offer and not quite a question. Mrs. Hale, Mabel said carefully, I am not going to ask you to do my bookkeeping. You're not asking, I'm offering. Dorothy's voice was even but firm. I know ledgers. You know this operation. Between an evening and tomorrow morning, we can have something Prudhomme can file with. Mabel looked at her for a moment. This woman who had sent her to the broken kitchen, who had told her the true reason only the night before, who had kept a folder for 4 years against a contingency she hadn't been willing to name out loud, who was now sitting at Mabel's table offering to do her books. All right, Mabel said. They worked from after supper until past 10 o'clock, with the kitchen quiet around them and the ranch settled into its night sounds. Dorothy took the notebook and a fresh sheet of paper and began transposing entries into proper column format while Mabel talked her through the context of each entry. What the supply source was, what the traffic pattern behind a particular expenditure meant, which costs were one-time and which were ongoing. Dorothy asked precise questions and wrote precise answers and did not once comment on anything she found beyond what was functionally necessary. At one point, around 9 o'clock when the candle was burning lower and the night had gone fully dark outside, Dorothy looked up from a page and said, without preamble, You've been profitable since the 6th week. I thought so, Mabel said. I wasn't sure because I wasn't tracking it formally. You were tracking it, you just weren't totaling the columns. Dorothy looked at the page. Your operating cost per meal is lower than the main kitchen's, considerably. I buy less. I waste less. Mabel refilled the water cup she'd set beside Dorothy earlier. The main kitchen is cooking for a household as well as a workforce. The overhead is different. Harold doesn't know this. It's your kitchen to run. Dorothy looked up at her sharply. Something moved across her face. Not the complicated expression this time. Something cleaner and more uncomfortable. The expression of someone who has just heard a thing that is straightforward and accurate and costs something to receive. It won't be, she said, when the deed transfers. No, Mabel agreed. It won't. They went back to the ledger. Neither of them mentioned Thomas or the biscuit lesson or the evening in the dining room or any of the specific moments that had accumulated between them into whatever this was. They worked on the numbers until Dorothy was satisfied with the format and Mabel was satisfied with the accuracy, and then Dorothy gathered the pages into a neat stack and said she would take them to Prudhomme with the registration fee in the morning. I'll pay the fee back, Mabel said. Yes, Dorothy said simply. You will. She stood up and picked up the papers. The 4th trail boss came in while I was in Emmett County. Mabel looked up. What? Harold told me when I got back. A man named Aldous Crane. He runs the Northern Colorado outfit, which is the largest single cattle operation currently driving through this territory. He didn't leave an offer. He left his camp location and said he'd wait. Dorothy's expression was dry and very slightly satisfied. Harold said, Crane looked at the kitchen and said, and I quote, that he wouldn't negotiate for something this good at a table this small and that Miss Whitlock should come to him when she was ready. He said that. Harold was quite taken with him. Dorothy moved to the door. I was less taken because a man who sends for people rather than coming himself is a man who believes the power to make people come to him is a thing worth demonstrating. She paused at the door. That said, Crane controls the Northern Colorado route. His outfit is 4 times Ritter's size. That doesn't change anything, Mabel said. No, Dorothy agreed, but it's information. She opened the door. The night came in, cool now, the first edge of fall in it, the smell of dry grass and distant water. Good night. Good night. Mabel sat at the table after Dorothy left and let herself feel the accumulated weight of the day. Ritter, Cutter, Dorothy's folder, the registration. Aldous Crane, waiting somewhere north of the crossing at a camp, large enough that he didn't feel the need to come to her himself. The deed transfer potentially compressing from 3 weeks to 10 days. The competing claim and its procedural vulnerabilities sitting in Prudhomme's hands alongside 4 years of Dorothy's careful documentation. The 4th trail boss. She hadn't expected 4. She thought about what Dutch had said weeks ago, before any of this. You're a cook who thinks like a trail boss. She thought about Thomas again. Not the ache, not the memory, exactly, but a specific quality of his that she had spent 2 years trying to locate in the world around her without success, and had found unexpectedly in the trail kitchen he'd never seen. He had believed in her capacity before she fully did, not with speeches, with the ordinary daily evidence of trusting her judgment, asking her opinion on things outside the kitchen, listening to what she said as if it had weight. You didn't know how much that cost until you tried to live without it. She had been living without it for 2 years, and somewhere in the 10 weeks since Dorothy had pointed at the door and said, "Take her to the bunkhouse kitchen," she had stopped needing it from an external source the way she'd needed it before, not because she didn't miss it, because she had found enough evidence in her own work to run on. She got up and went to the stove and checked the damper for the night. She blew out the remaining candle. In the morning, she would need to think about Crane and how to approach someone who expected people to come to him. She would need to coordinate between Prudhomme and Aldridge. She would need to write back to Cutter with the supply agreement terms and to Ritter with a formal response to his offer that was neither acceptance nor refusal, but something honest in between. Something that acknowledged the quality of the offer and explained why she was staying without making him feel that she was turning down something beneath her, because she wasn't, and she knew it, and Ritter deserved that acknowledged. She would need to keep cooking, because whatever else was happening around the kitchen itself required breakfast at 6, and she had 20 men expecting it, and a pot of beans that had been building flavor for 3 days and was approaching its best hour. She would do the things in sequence, and she would do them well, and she would not make the mistake of letting the scale of what had developed distract her from the fundamental truth, which was that all of it, Ritter and Beaumont and Cutter and Crane and Veal and Dorothy's folder and Prudhomme's office in Emmett County and the deed transfer and the business registration, all of it had started with a pot of beans and a decision to make them right. She went to the cot and lay down and listened to the night. The mice were quiet. The trail outside was dark and still. Somewhere to the north, in a camp she hadn't seen, a man named Aldous Crane was presumably waiting with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for things of value, and she let him wait because she was not ready to go to him yet, and she knew the difference between readiness and delay. She slept. She woke at 4:30 as she always did before the sky was anything but black, and she started the fire. Prudhomme's letter arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after Dorothy had ridden to Emmett County with the formatted ledger and the $12 registration fee. Mabel was at the stove when Skeeter came through the door with it, still slightly out of breath from riding fast from the mail stop, and he held it out with the particular expression of someone who understands the weight of what they're carrying without knowing its contents. She dried her hands on her apron and took it. The letter was 2 pages in Prudhomme's careful, slightly cramped hand. She read it standing at the work table while the morning's bean pot simmered behind her and the smell of fresh bread moved through the kitchen from the oven, and she read it twice, because the first time she needed to make sure she had understood the words correctly, and the second time she needed to make sure she had understood what the words meant. The business registration had been accepted and filed. Whitlock's kitchen at Red Cedar Crossing was now a formal commercial enterprise in the county record. The deed transfer, accelerated by the registered business documentation, was complete. The competing claim filed by Garrett's investors had been challenged and suspended pending review. On the basis of the prior claim, irregularity Prudhomme had found in the survey documents and the procedural documentation that Aldridge had submitted independently from Cutter's side. 2 separate legal challenges arriving at the land office within 24 hours of each other, which the Dalton City land officer had apparently found sufficiently compelling to suspend acceptance of the Veal filing rather than process it. The station property, the stone foundation building at the crossing, the one Mabel had walked past and calculated and not moved on because the bunkhouse had been the first priority, was listed in the letter's final paragraph as a separate matter, with a note that the suspended claim created a window for a counterfiling if she was interested, and that Prudhomme had taken the liberty of drafting the relevant documents in anticipation of her decision. Mabel set the letter down on the work table. She stood there for a moment with both hands flat on the pine surface, and the morning light coming through the new glass of the western window and the bread smell and the bean smell around her, and she felt something that was not triumph. Triumph was too loud, too self-congratulatory for what this was, but was something quieter and more solid. The feeling of a foundation being poured, the feeling of a thing that would hold weight. Skeeter was still in the kitchen, which she had forgotten. He was standing near the door with an expression of barely contained curiosity. "Good news?" he said. "Yes," she said. "How good?" She looked at him. This boy who had brought her water on the first night, who had told her Dorothy was scared of her, who had eaten 3 biscuits that first morning and looked at his hands afterward with mild astonishment. He was 20 now, she thought, maybe 21. He had grown into his chin a little in the past 2 months. Go find Dutch, she said. Tell him I need him, and I need him now. Skeeter went at a near run. Dutch came in 5 minutes later with the unhurried pace of a man who does not run for things but moves efficiently toward them. He read the letter standing at the work table the way Mabel had, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at it for a moment. The station property, he said. Yes. If you counterfile and it holds, you'd have both buildings. That's what I'm thinking. He looked up at her. That's a different enterprise than a kitchen. I know what it is. She picked up the letter. Can we get Cutter's lawyer to submit the counterfiling on the station the same way he submitted the challenge, independent of Prudhomme but coordinated? Aldridge is still in the area. I can ride to Cutter's camp this morning. Tell him the deed is finalized. The supply agreement can be discussed now. She paused. Tell him also that the station filing, if it goes through, changes the terms of the supply agreement because it changes what's being supplied from. He should know that before he commits. Dutch looked at her steadily. You're renegotiating before you've even filed. I'm giving him accurate information so that whatever he agrees to is based on reality. That's not renegotiation. That's honesty. Something in Dutch's face shifted into an expression she didn't see often on it. Not the reluctant smile, something more direct than that. I'll ride out this morning, he said, and picked up his hat. Dutch. He stopped at the door. Thank you. For all of it. The supply runs, the information, the network, the hand on my shoulder. She said the last part simply, without making it larger than it was. You kept this place running when it shouldn't have been able to. He stood there for a moment with his hat in his hand. His face had the expression of a man who is receiving something he doesn't entirely know how to hold. You kept it running, he said. I just helped with the weight. He put his hat on and went out. She fed breakfast to 17 men that morning, including 4 from an outfit she'd never seen before, who had heard about the crossing from someone in a town 30 miles east and had deliberately routed through. She fed them the beans and fresh bread and the last of the dried apricots stewed into a compote that she'd been experimenting with as a breakfast addition. And they ate with the focused appreciation of men who had not expected much and received considerably more. After breakfast, she wrote letters to Ritter, to Beaumont, to Cutter, directly confirming the supply agreement discussion and the station situation, and a separate careful letter to a man she had not yet met in person, Aldous Crane. She had been thinking about how to approach this letter for 2 days, ever since Dorothy had told her about the 4th trail boss waiting at his camp. The approach was delicate in a specific way. Crane had sent for her rather than coming himself, which was a power demonstration, and responding in a way that either capitulated to the demonstration or overcorrected against it would both be wrong. What was required was something that acknowledged the size of his operation without being impressed by it, stated her position clearly, and left room for a conversation rather than a transaction. She wrote 3 drafts. The first was too formal, the second too familiar. The third was a single paragraph that said, she had received his message from Harold Hale. She understood he had visited the kitchen in her absence. She would be at the crossing for the foreseeable future, and he was welcome to come by whenever his schedule allowed, and that she preferred to discuss business arrangements in her kitchen rather than at anyone else's camp, because she had found that food produced better conversations than distance did. She read it back once and sent it with the afternoon mail rider. Prudhomme's counter-filing documents for the station property arrived by express rider 2 days later. The express rider was an extra cost that Prudhomme had charged to the business account he'd set up when he registered the enterprise, which Mabel had not authorized, but which she accepted because the speed was worth the cost, and because Prudhomme had been right about most things so far. She took the documents to Dorothy. Dorothy read them at the dining table while Harold made himself scarce in the way that Harold had perfected over the years of his marriage, which was to be genuinely useful somewhere else without making it obvious he was giving them room. Dorothy read each page twice in her systematic way and made 2 small notes in the margin in pencil. The station property filing is stronger than the bunkhouse deed transfer was, Dorothy said, because the prior claim irregularity in Veal's original filing gives you grounds not just to challenge, but to establish superior claim. You're not just saying their filing is wrong, you're saying you have a better right to the property. That's what Prudhomme argued. He's right. Dorothy looked at the marginal notes she'd made. There are 2 places where the language could be tightened. I'll write the suggested revisions and you can send them back to Prudhomme tonight. She looked up. How are you paying for all of this? It was the question Mabel had been running the arithmetic on for 2 days. Legal fees, express riders, the station filing itself, the registration. The tin box under the cot had been adequate for the business registration, but the accumulation of costs since then had moved past what she had saved. Cutter's supply agreement, she said. He's agreed to a signing advance against the first season's contract. Dorothy's eyebrows moved slightly. He advanced you money before the agreement was signed. He advanced it because I asked directly and gave him accurate information about where the costs were going. He's not a charity. He has a direct interest in the station filing succeeding because it doubles the capacity of the kitchen operation and makes his supply agreement more valuable. She met Dorothy's eyes. I'm not taking money I don't have a clear plan to repay. Dorothy held her gaze for a moment, then she went back to the documents and picked up her pencil. I'll have the revisions done in an hour, she said. Aldous Crane arrived at the bunkhouse kitchen on a Monday morning, 9 days after she'd sent the letter. He was not what she'd expected, which she had been careful not to expect anything specific in order to avoid the limitation of expectations. He was older than the other 3 trail bosses, 60 or near it, with white hair and a large, deliberate frame that moved with the economy of a man who had stopped wasting motion sometime in his 40s. He came alone, which she had not anticipated given how he'd communicated through Harold, and he tied his own horse and came through the door without announcing himself and sat down at the end of the table where Clarence usually sat and looked around the room with the comprehensive, unhurried assessment of a man who had evaluated a great many things in his life and had learned to take the time the evaluation required. The breakfast rush was over. The kitchen was quiet. Mabel was doing the mid-morning prep. The bread for tomorrow, the beans refreshed, a calculation about supper. She put coffee in front of him and went back to her bread. He drank the coffee. He did not speak for a while, which she matched without difficulty because she had been doing other things and did not feel obligated to perform for a man sitting at her table. You wrote that food produces better conversations than distance, he said eventually. I believe that. I sent for you because I wanted to see if you'd come. You didn't. I was busy, she said, not apologetically, just accurately. He made a sound that was approximately a laugh, low and brief. Fair enough. He turned his cup in his hands. The station filing. I heard this morning from Cutter. She turned around. What did Cutter tell you? That you filed a superior claim on the station property at the crossing. That Veal's competing claim has been formally suspended pending review. He looked at her directly. His eyes were gray and very clear, the kind of clear that comes from decades of looking at outdoor distances. And that you're going to build something at that crossing that changes how cattle drives route through this territory. I'm going to build a kitchen, she said. A real one. The station has a stone foundation and sound walls and enough space to feed twice what the bunkhouse holds. And the bunkhouse stays as it is. Overflow capacity and supply storage. 2 buildings, he said. 2 buildings. He looked at his cup. You know what I run. The Northern Colorado outfit. Largest single operation currently driving through the territory, Harold told me. 4 times Ritter's size, which means 4 times the men, 4 times the supply requirements, 4 times the commission if you were to have an exclusive supply arrangement for the Northern Colorado route. He paused, which is what I'm here to propose. She looked at him steadily. I don't do exclusive arrangements. His eyebrows went up slightly. No? Ritter needs this crossing. Cutter needs it. Beaumont's outfit comes through twice a season. If I commit to exclusive service for the Northern Colorado route, I'm telling 3 other legitimate operators that the kitchen I've built isn't available to them. That's not a business. That's a dependency. She went back to her bread. I'd rather have 4 reliable partnerships than 1 exclusive one, even if the one is larger. Crane was quiet for a long moment. She could feel him thinking. Not the restless, calculating thinking of a man who was looking for leverage, but the slower, more thorough thinking of a man who was reassessing something he'd walked in assuming. What are you offering instead? He said. Priority service. During your drive season, Northern Colorado outfit gets first table. Reserve capacity for your crew size. Supply guaranteed regardless of traffic. That's more valuable than exclusivity because it comes with a guaranteed quality standard. She turned around. Exclusive means you're the only one. Priority means you're first, and first at a table that's always worth being first at. He looked at her for a long time. His large hands were still on the table, the coffee cup between them, and he had the expression of a man who had come in expecting a negotiation of a particular type and was finding himself in a different conversation than he'd prepared for. The Northern Colorado route brings 300 men through this crossing in a season, he said. Full drive. I have been taking the eastern route the past 2 years because there was nothing suitable on the western one. I know, she said. Cutter told me. Cutter and I have been on the same route because the western crossing had nothing worth stopping for. He paused. That's changed. Yes. The priority arrangement. What does it cost? She named a figure. It was a real figure, calculated from the notebook records and the operating costs of the expanded operation she was projecting for the station building. Not a figure designed to impress or intimidate, but a number that represented what the service was actually worth and what she needed to sustain it. She had done this arithmetic 3 times before this conversation to make sure it was right. Crane looked at the number she'd written on the paper she slid across the table. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that is higher than he expected and lower than he feared, which is the range where real business happens. Per season, he said. Per season. Paid at the start of the drive, not the end. He picked up the paper, read it again, set it down. You want the station property to be operating before I commit. I want you to see what you're buying before you buy it, she said. Come back in the spring. The station will be running by then. Eat at the new table. If it's not worth what I'm asking, tell me why and we'll talk about it. He stood up. He was very large standing. She had forgotten, while he was sitting, how much space a man of his frame occupied. He folded the paper with the figure on it and put it in his coat pocket. I'll come back in the spring, he said. You're welcome anytime. He put his payment on the table. For the coffee, for the time, for something she couldn't entirely name. And he walked to the door and stopped there the way Ritter had stopped, the way most of them stopped, with the quality of a man who has one more thing to say and is deciding whether to say it. My wife died 11 years ago, he said, not looking at her, looking at the door. She was a cook, not a professional one, a farm cook, fed everything that came near the place without distinction. A pause. I've been eating at tables across 4 territories for 11 years trying to find something that felt like sitting down to eat rather than fueling up to keep moving. He put his hand on the doorframe. This is the first time. He went out before she could answer, which was probably intentional, and she heard him untie his horse and ride north. She stood at the work table with the bread dough in her hands and the morning lay in the room and what he'd said sitting in the air around her, and she felt the weight of it. Not the compliment in it, but the human truth of it. The thing he'd been carrying for 11 years that had nothing to do with cattle routes or supply agreements and everything to do with what it meant to be a person who needed more than fuel. She had built this kitchen partly from stubbornness and partly from necessity and partly from the specific determination of a woman who had been told she didn't matter enough times that she had developed a deep, unshakable counter-opinion. But she had also built it from something that she had not named directly until this moment. Standing with her hands in bread dough after a man walked out the door carrying 11 years of a particular kind of loneliness. She had built it because Thomas had taught her that a table was not just a surface. A table was a decision. Every day you set one was a decision about what kind of person you were and what kind of world you were willing to make inside the 4 walls you had available to you. Thomas had made that decision every day of their marriage with the uncomplaining dailiness of someone who understood that love was not a feeling but a practice, and when he died she had not known for a long time what to do with the practice without its original recipient. She had found out, apparently, by feeding strangers at a broken-down bunkhouse kitchen at a river crossing in the middle of the frontier. The station property counterfiling was accepted 14 days after submission. Prudhomme sent word by regular mail. He was conservative with express riders, which she appreciated. And the letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while she was in the middle of feeding a crew of 9 from an outfit she'd seen twice before. She read it after they'd gone and sat with it for a while and then folded it into the notebook beside Ritter's envelope and Cutter's signed supply agreement, which had been finalized the week before with terms that both parties found workable. The Veal competing claim was formally rejected the following week. She heard about this not from Prudhomme, but from Dutch, who had a source in the Dalton City Land Office whose name he didn't share and whose information had been reliable throughout. The rejection was final. There was no appeal mechanism for an abandoned property claim that had been superseded by a documented prior right and a formal business registration. Garrett's card was in the fire before she'd finished thinking about whether to keep it. The work on the station building began 3 days after the deed confirmed. She had not planned on it beginning that quickly, but she had not entirely planned on what happened when word got through the outfit network that Whitlock's kitchen at Red Cedar Crossing had filed and won on the station property. Ritter arrived first, which she had half expected. He came with 4 of his men on a Saturday and they showed up at the station building with tools, which she had not expected at all. "We're not hired," he said when she came across the yard to meet them. "We're just here." "Amos," she said carefully, "I didn't accept your offer." "I know you didn't." He looked at the station building, the stone foundation, the walls that were sound but weathered, the roof that needed replacing as Dorothy had noted 2 years ago. I'm not here about the offer. I'm here because you didn't accept it and you're still building something anyway, and that's worth more to me than a cook. He pulled on his gloves. Which wall do you want to start on? Beaumont came 2 days later with 6 men and lumber in a wagon, which he had apparently sourced and purchased and transported without telling anyone he was doing it, presenting it at the gate with his large, room-filling grin and the energy of a man who considers the logistics of surprise gifts entirely straightforward. You didn't have to, Mabel started. I know, Beaumont said. Where do you want it stacked? Cutter sent Aldridge instead of coming himself, which was exactly what Mabel would have predicted. Aldridge arrived on a Wednesday with a letter from Cutter explaining that he'd been delayed by a drive complication, but that Aldridge could turn a reasonable hand with construction work and was to be put to use however was most useful. Aldridge, who was a neat, quiet man in his late 30s who had clearly had a legal education and an outdoor upbringing in equal measure, turned out to be excellent with a roof frame, which was the most pressing structural need. The red cedar hands worked alongside all of them. Dutch coordinated without appearing to coordinate. He had the rare ability to organize men's labor by making suggestions that felt like observations, so that everyone ended up doing the right thing without the friction of having been directed. Skeeter developed a system for moving lumber that was more efficient than the one the experienced carpenter suggested, and that Aldridge, to his credit, adopted without ego. Clarence, who was old enough to have built 3 buildings in his life before Red Cedar, worked on the stone foundation repairs with the methodical precision of someone who knows that everything resting on a foundation depends on the foundation being right. Harold appeared on the 4th day and worked without saying much, which was how Harold expressed most things. He was good with the heavy lifting, which his size made straightforward, and he carried roof materials up the improvised scaffolding with the steady patience of a man doing penance that nobody had asked for, but that seemed, to him, necessary. Dorothy did not come to the construction site. She sent food. Regular, deliberate deliveries from the main kitchen to the station building site, time to arrive at the appropriate meals, enough for the crew working, and then some. Rosa, who had survived Dorothy's management for 4 years by being entirely reliable, carried the deliveries herself, which Mabel understood was Dorothy's way of sending a message through a proxy she trusted. On the 7th day, Mabel walked over to the main house at midday and knocked on the back door. Dorothy answered. She was in her work clothes, which were always neat but not formal, and she had ink on her right index finger, which meant she'd been at her correspondence. The roof is going on today, Mabel said. I thought you might want to see it. Dorothy looked at her for a moment, then she took off her apron, hung it on the hook beside the door, and walked with Mabel across the yard to the station building without saying anything. She stood at the edge of the worksite and watched Aldridge and Skeeter maneuver the last section of roof frame into position. She watched Ritter's men working alongside red cedar hands without friction. The specific, easy efficiency of people who have been doing shared physical labor long enough to stop being strangers. She watched Harold carry a beam up the scaffolding and set it in place with a care that suggested he was being deliberate about it. She stood there for a long time. It's going to be a proper building, she said finally. Yes, Mabel said. Better than the bunkhouse. Different, not the same purpose. Mabel looked at the walls, the new roof taking shape above them, the stone foundation that had been there for 20 years, waiting for someone to build on it properly. The bunkhouse will stay as it is, supply storage and overflow kitchen. The station is where the main operation moves. Dorothy nodded slowly. And the bunkhouse kitchen, she said, the lease, transfers to a storage and auxiliary agreement once the station deed is in my name. Prudhomme has the paperwork. I know, he sent me a copy. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. It specifies that the bunkhouse remains part of your registered business operation even after the auxiliary transition. Yes, because it's where everything started and because I'm not interested in pretending it didn't exist. Dorothy turned to look at her. The afternoon light was on her face, and for a moment she looked older than she usually presented. Not worse, just truer, the way people look when they stop holding a specific expression and let their face rest into whatever is actually there underneath it. She was 50, Mabel guessed, maybe a few years past. She had the bearing of someone who had spent 50 years being competent and had received competence's traditional rewards, which were more responsibility and less warmth. I misjudged you, Dorothy said. Not for the first time, but the first time had been about the kitchen. This was about something larger. When you arrived, I saw a woman who was, she stopped, organized the words. I saw what I expected to see, someone temporary, someone who would be adequate for a season and then move on. She looked at the building. I couldn't see past what you looked like to what you were. Most people couldn't, Mabel said. That's not an excuse. I know it isn't. Mabel watched Aldridge on the roof frame, his movements careful and unhurried. I've been that invisible my whole life. You weren't the first, and you won't be the last. But you're the one who changed, which is rarer than the original mistake. Dorothy made a sound. Not quite a laugh, but something in that range, short and unguarded. It was the most unguarded sound Mabel had ever heard from her. That's a generous reading of what I did. It's an accurate one. They stood together, watching the construction for a while longer. Two women in the afternoon light, not talking, not needing to. The hammer sounds and the men's voices and the smell of new lumber and old stone were around them, and somewhere across the yard, the bunkhouse kitchen was putting out its familiar smell of coffee and simmering things, and the trail beyond the fence line was carrying its continuous low sound of moving cattle and horses and the frontier going about its endless business. The station building was completed in 11 days, which was faster than anyone had planned and slower than Skeeter had optimistically predicted on day one. The roof was solid. The windows had glass. Real glass, 4 of them, installed properly in frames that had been measured and cut rather than improvised. The floor was wood, not packed dirt, laid by Clarence and one of Beaumont's men who turned out to have done exactly this kind of flooring work before. The stove was new, purchased from a supplier in Dalton City at a price that had required careful management of the cutter advance. And it drew clean from the first lighting, which was not a given with new installations and which made Mabel less anxious than she had been trying not to appear. She cooked the first meal in the station kitchen on a Friday evening for the men who had built it. 31 people sat at the new tables. Some of the benches were still rough, the wood not fully finished, and 2 of the windows were letting in a draft that needed weather stripping she hadn't gotten to yet, and the stove was running slightly hot at the top, and she was still learning its particular temperament. None of these things were solved. All of them were workable. She made a beef stew that had been going since the previous day, the way the good stews go, slow and dark and built in layers, not rushed, not clever, just patient. She made bread in the bunkhouse oven and carried it across the yard in batches. She made the peach hand pies because she had dried peaches and because they were the thing the Cowboys always asked about, and because this was a night that deserved something people would remember. Ritter sat at one end of the table. Beaumont, who had appeared that afternoon with the timing of a man who had been keeping track of the schedule, sat at the other. Aldridge was somewhere in the middle. Dutch was next to Clarence. Skeeter was next to Harold, which was an unlikely pairing that seemed to be working fine. Dorothy sat at the table, which she had done before in the bunkhouse kitchen, but not often, and she ate without commenting on the food, which from Dorothy was the equivalent of extended applause. Carson appeared at the door halfway through supper with his hat in his hand and an apologetic expression. "I was passing through," he said. "Somebody told me there was a new building." "Sit down," Mabel said. "There's enough." There was always enough. That was the decision she made every morning when she started the fire. Not to cook for the people she knew were coming, but for everyone who might come. It cost more planning and more supply and more judgment about quantities, and it was not a decision that made the arithmetic simple, but it was the decision that made the kitchen what it was, and it was not a decision she was going to change because the kitchen had moved to a bigger building. After supper, while men were still sitting with their coffee and the room had the low, comfortable sound of people who have eaten well and don't have anywhere immediate to be, Ritter came to find her at the back of the kitchen where she was doing her end-of-day organization. "I have a proposition," he said. She looked at him. "Another one. A different one." He leaned against the back wall with his arms crossed, and he had the careful expression of a man who has revised his thinking and is now presenting the revised version. "The job offer was wrong. I knew that when I made it, but I made it anyway because it was the kind of offer I knew how to make." He paused. "What you've built here is not a cook's job. What you've built here is a business that happens to involve cooking. Those are different things and they require a different kind of conversation." "What kind of conversation?" she said. "A slow one," he said. "Over time. I want to supply this kitchen, not as a customer, as a supplier. My ranch in Texas raises cattle. Some of those cattle could come to you directly rather than to the railhead at a price that works for both of us, which means you're not sourcing beef from whoever happens to have it, and I'm building a reliable local market that doesn't depend entirely on the rail price." He looked at her steadily. "That's a long-term arrangement, multiple seasons, requires trust on both sides." Mabel looked at him for a long moment. This was the offer he should have made the first time, and she suspected he knew that, which was why he'd revised it. A supply arrangement was not a hiring arrangement. A supply arrangement was one business dealing with another on equal footing with mutual dependency rather than employment dependency. "I'll want to see your ranch records," she said. "Prices, quantities, delivery logistics, in writing." "Expected," he said. "I'll have them to Prudhomme by the end of the month." "Good." She turned back to her work. "And Amos?" The first offer, the cook's job." She kept her hands moving, organizing, restoring order to the end of a long day. "It was a good offer. Don't be embarrassed by it." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not embarrassed," he said. "I just recognize what I was looking at more clearly now than I did then." He went back to the table. She finished the kitchen and stood at the back door for a moment before closing up, looking out at the crossing. The trail coming in from the south, the river running in the dark, the sound of cattle bedded somewhere in the middle distance, the stars doing what they always did, which was be entirely indifferent to individual human situations and magnificent anyway. She thought about the first morning, the smoke-filled room, the single candle, Skeeter's bucket of water, the tin plates filmed with gray residue, the floor she had swept 4 times before it was something she could call improved. She thought about Dorothy saying take her to the bunkhouse kitchen, and the way the room had gone quiet, and the way Ed Pruitt had been careful with her supply crate, and the cold, specific feeling of standing in a broken building in the early afternoon and making the decision that would shape everything that came after it. The decision had not felt large at the time. That was the thing nobody told you about the decisions that turn out to matter most. They feel like the only available option, not like a choice. She had gone into the bunkhouse kitchen because there was nowhere else to go, and she had cleaned it because a dirty kitchen was not a kitchen, and she had made biscuits because the men needed breakfast, and she had made them right because making them wrong was not something she was willing to do regardless of who was watching. That was all it had been. Every morning, do the thing right. Every day, feed whoever comes through the door. Every week, build the small thing that the week allows, and don't wait for the large thing to become possible first. She had not transformed herself. She had not become someone different or harder or more impressive than the woman who had arrived at Red Cedar with a reference letter and a supply of stubbornness. She was still the woman who was too big and too plain and too quiet for rooms that expected performance. She still had the cough that came back when the wind changed, and her left arch still complained by midday, and she still woke at 4:30, regardless of how late she'd worked the night before, which was not a superpower, but just the body's habits outlasting the will's preferences. What had changed was the room around her. The room had expanded. Not metaphorically, literally. She had started in a broken bunkhouse kitchen that nobody wanted, and she was standing now in a stone foundation building with glass windows and a real floor and a stove that drew clean. And outside the front door was a trail crossing that 4 of the most significant cattle operations in the territory were routing through specifically because of what she had built. The room had expanded because she had refused to treat its original smallness as a permanent condition. There was a lesson in that, she supposed, though she was wary of lessons that resolved too cleanly, because real life didn't resolve that cleanly, and she had seen enough of it to know the difference. The lesson, if you wanted to call it that, was not that hard work always wins, or that goodness always overcomes cruelty, or that the world reliably rewards the deserving. None of those things were true in any consistent way, and she would not pretend they were. The actual lesson was smaller and more durable. It was this: the space you're given and the space you occupy are not the same thing, and confusing them is the mistake that keeps most people smaller than they need to be. Dorothy had given her a broken kitchen as a punishment, but Mabel had decided in the first hour that the broken kitchen was not the limit of what she was. The broken kitchen was the material she'd been given to work with. What she did with it was her own business. That distinction between what you're handed and what you make was the only reliable advantage she'd ever found. It didn't require anything external. It didn't require someone to recognize you first. It only required you to be clear in your own understanding about which one you were dealing with at any given moment. She closed the back door and went through the kitchen, turning down the lamp. The new building settled around her, still slightly unfamiliar, still with the specific smell of fresh wood and new stone that would take a few weeks to replace with the smell of cooking and use. She walked through the dining room where 31 people had eaten that evening and where the tables still had the evidence of it. The crumb patterns, the cup rings, the comfortable disorder of a room that had been properly used. She stopped at the front door. Through the window, the crossing was visible in the dark. The trail, the river, the faint outline of the old bunkhouse against the night sky. She could see a light in the main house, which meant Dorothy was at her correspondence late. She could see the bunkhouse light where Dutch was doing something she didn't need to know about. She could see, on the far side of the crossing, the fires of at least 2 outfits camped for the night, the small, reliable constellations of people passing through a landscape that didn't care about them in any particular way, but through which they moved with the stubborn persistence of people who had somewhere to be. In the spring, Aldous Crane would come back. She would have the priority service terms ready and the supply capacity expanded, and she would feed him at the new table and let the food make the argument she'd already made in the letter, which was that this was a place worth stopping at and worth returning to and worth routing a 4 times Ritter-sized operation through a changed road to reach. And Crane was a man who had eaten at tables across 4 territories for 11 years, looking for something that felt like sitting down. And she knew, not arrogantly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had done the work, that this table would be that thing for him. In the spring, the first full season of Whitlock's Kitchen at Red Cedar Crossing would run with 4 supply agreements in place, 3 priority service arrangements, a beef supply deal from Ritter's Texas ranch that Prudhomme had verified and Dorothy had audited without being asked, and an operation that 2 buildings could sustain where one had been enough to start. In the spring, Skeeter would ask her with elaborate casualness if she needed a permanent hand at the station kitchen, because he'd been thinking about staying on past his Red Cedar contract and he'd heard, again with elaborate casualness, that the new kitchen might be hiring. She would say yes before he finished the sentence, because she had watched him grow into his chin and his judgment over the past 4 months, and she was not going to lose a good person to elaborate casualness. All of that was the spring. Tonight was tonight. She put her hand on the doorframe the way Crane had, the way Ritter had, the way most of them did. That brief pause before leaving. The moment where a person holds the threshold and takes a last account of what's behind them. She took the account. The new floor, the glass windows, the clean stove, the settled smell of the first meal in a kitchen that was hers. Then she let go of the doorframe and stepped outside into the cooling night air and walked back across the yard to the bunkhouse, where the cot was still inadequate and the last of the mice were still conducting their nightly audit of the walls, and she lay down on it without complaint, because she had learned a long time ago that imperfect beds were not the problem they appeared to be when you were tired enough and had done enough good work in the day to earn the tiredness. She was asleep before the stars had moved much at all. In the morning, she woke at 4:30, as she always did, before the sky was anything but black, and she crossed the yard to the station kitchen and started the fire in the new stove, and the chimney drew clean on the first try, and she put the coffee on, and she got to work.